Thank you so much, Suzanne and Dan, for being here tonight to brief us. I'll turn over to Robbie if you want to say anything.
Thank you, Mayor Pace.
No?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So a few weeks ago, I shared with most of you, not all of you, welcome to Councilor Salgado. So because we had so much turnover on council this year, we thought it would be a good idea, maybe for the first half of this year, to hold some work sessions, kind of this Hillsboro 101 theme. And not only would it be helpful for some of the new councilors, but for the community in general to kind of learn some of these things about Hillsboro that are really foundational to who we are. And so we have several of these scheduled over the next few months. And tonight we're going to be focused on, as Mayor Pace mentioned, economic incentives, public finance, and a very high level budget overview. We have the pre-council work session today that they're going to talk a little bit about, especially kind of the high level budget, because we have some big budget meetings coming up over the next few months. And then the post-council work session will dive deeper as well. So there'll be plenty of time for questions both during this work session, but also later on after the main meeting today. So with that, I will turn it over to Suzanne.
Yes. Hi, good evening. Suzanne Lenine, Chief Financial Officer for the record. Thanks for having Dan and myself here this evening. We are planning on tag teaming this presentation a little bit. And this is our first, I guess, Hillsboro 101 doing this together. So there's a lot of information that we're trying to bring together in a cohesive way, but there's going to be questions, and we get that. And probably you'll leave with questions tonight and go, God, I wish I would ask that. So there's no limitation on when you can ask a question. So if something comes up later that you want to know more about, please let us know. That's what we're here for, is to provide information and help you all understand what we hope to be able to impart on you this evening. So as Robbie said, we can take questions during the work session. We are the pre and post work session. We do think we have a pretty good break in our work session timing, but who knows exactly how many questions will come up as we're going. So we can either, if we go long, then and don't and hit our break, we might say let's stop now and have questions. But but we have after too. So if we end up a little early, then maybe we'll start on our second part of the presentation and get a head start. So maybe we can get you guys out of here early. But we'll just kind of play that by ear and see how that goes. So a lot of times, I like to say this up front, a lot of times questions come up in these types of settings that are really detailed and very specific. We may not be able to answer that tonight. So we may say, hey, we need to get back to you with that. And then of course we would share that with the entire council when we have that answer. It's not just because it might be specific, but it might just be a matter of my ability to recall something at a moment in time, which seems to be harder and harder with a lot of 30 years of information all sitting up here. So just with that said, if we can't get something to you this evening, we'll certainly follow back up. So this agenda for this evening is to try to give you a basic background on budget, and we're going to do a deeper dive on budget come February 26th. So we're coming up to our first budget committee meeting, but we're going to dabble in budget a little bit, but we're also going to focus on how things are funded at both the state and city level, and jump into how economic development plays a key role in our local tax base, as well as the state of Oregon's revenue structure. We'll talk about that a little bit and how they're primarily based on an income tax basis. We'll go through some of the various programs, tax programs that the city employs, and then we'll including SIP, Strategic Investment Program, E-zones, enterprise zones, gain share. We'll talk specifically about the three of those. We'll also get into urban renewal a little bit this evening. And then we'll talk specifically about what does this mean for Hillsboro? What does all of these programs that we've employed and we've put into place over these many, many years, what has that done for Hillsboro? And there's lots of different ways to look at that. We think we have some information that is compelling and it does tell an interesting story of our investment in economic development. And we'll share that towards the end of the presentation today. So next slide, please. So just putting some policy context behind as we start the presentation, what are some of the things that governs us as we think about the things that we go about in terms of putting together the budget, in terms of our economic development agenda. So budgetarily, responsible to meet all the Oregon revised statutes around Oregon local budget law. There's all sorts of laws on the books related to property taxes, including Measure 50 and Measure 5, which we'll get into a little bit of detail on. Our citywide strategic plan also guides us in the city's budget, our Hillsboro 2035 community plan, as well as our city council priorities, which you all will be meeting here shortly. I think it's February 8th or something like that for your annual retreat. And out of that usually comes some changes to council priorities, which also informs us as we put together our biennium budget, which we are already well embarked into. And then, of course, we have some, each of our departments oftentimes will have their own department strategic plans that guides the budget in that way, departmentally. And then economic development, similarly, Hillsboro 2035, they also have the city comp plan. We have 2 established urban renewal districts within the city of Hillsboro, and those have adopted plans, as well as many, many, many Oregon revised statutes when it comes to land use planning and various other things. Anything you wanted to add there? Okay, next slide. So we're gonna, like I said, tag team it a little bit too. So we'll be crossing back and forth here on some of the slides. You can go to the next slide. Thank you, sir. So we're just going to take a few minutes to talk about the overall funding kind of at the state level. So I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with this, but I'm going to kind of just talk at a very high level. And if some of it is just like, oh, of course I know that, that's fine. But hopefully if there's some information that you don't know that I'm able to impart that tonight. So Oregon has only 2 legs of the stool when it comes to how we fund a state government and local government. We have an income tax and we have a property tax system. We do not have a general sales tax across the state of Oregon. That is good in some ways and not so good in other ways. I heard from an estate planner. My husband and I, as many of us do, meet with estate planners, right? You're looking at your future retirement and thinking about that. And what they said I thought was interesting, and I probably knew most of it, but at least 2 of the things that she imparted was that you want to work in Washington and live in Washington because you don't pay income taxes, right? And you want to shop in Oregon because you don't pay sales tax. But then when you get closer to retirement, you want to try to reside in California because they don't have estate taxes. So you could basically live on the entire West Coast and just move from Oregon to Washington to California. And I'm not advising anyone I'm not advising anyone about their taxes. What I am trying to impart is that we as individuals make decisions based on what are tax implications. And I think it's very important as we talk about this tonight is that so do businesses, small businesses and large businesses make decisions as to where they want to locate or potentially relocate, where they want to invest. And a lot of that is around what is their property tax burden? What is their income tax burden? What are the sales taxes going to be in the state that they're going to be moving to and locating in? So I just thought that was interesting because I think we forget, as individuals, we're making those decisions and so are businesses. Did you want to ask? Okay, yeah. One of the things that did come up I can't remember what legislative session it is, but the corporate activities tax that is kind of a sales tax, but kind of hidden behind. It's not you or I going to a store and paying that sales tax at the register, but it's behind the scenes, and those businesses are paying what's called a corporate activities tax if they achieve a certain amount of income in any given year. And that has been primarily going to the school fund. So I wanted to state that because that is still relatively new. And I would say that most people kind of see that as a sales tax. So even though we still believe we have somewhat of a 2-legged stool, we do have now this corporate activities tax. So I'm going to do a little going back in time and looking at Oregon's property tax system. It's been it's been a long time since we've actually made any significant changes to Oregon property taxes. It is a heavy lift. The legislature is very I would say, shy about embarking on serious property tax reform. So we're still living with legislation that was passed in the early and late 90s. And I realized one of my slides might be missing. Where you skipped it? Yes, this one. Sorry, backing up here. So Measure 5 limited general government property taxes to $10 per thousand on real market value, and school property taxes to $5 per thousand on real market value. And that measure was passed in 1990. Measure 47 was voted in. It was through the referendum process, and that limited property tax assessment to 3% unless there was new construction on top of that. It created permanent rates versus levy. So in the old days, the city of Hillsboro would go to the voters with a dollar amount, and we would say, we need $20 million to operate our general fund. And then that would either get voted in or it wouldn't. And then the county assessor would get that number, and then they would turn it into a rate. But what Measure 47 and then Measure 50 did, it created a permanent rate for all overlapping taxing jurisdictions within the state of Oregon. It also created temporary local option levies. So having a permanent rate, hence the word permanent, your rate doesn't change. It is always the same. Ours, and the next slide will tell you, it is $3 and 3.6665. That is our permanent rate for forever until there is any kind of property tax reform. So if you as a council say to us, hey, I want to increase our service levels, I want to do more, or hey, guess what? We can't maintain our service levels with the money that we're bringing in. What can we do? All that we have in our toolbox right now today is a local option levy. That is a 5-year levy. And that is why we're in front of the voters every 5 years with that levy. And I have a slide later that will speak to that a little bit more. So created temporary levies. It's a 5-year operating levy and a 10-year levy for capital. We have not asked the voters to consider a 10-year levy. We've only been to the voters with a 5-year operating levy. It turned back the clock on assessed value. So it was looking at different ways. Again, remember, this came through the initiative process. These were people that put this forward that wanted to reduce their property tax bill and wanted to, felt that government was getting too expensive, and they took matters in their own hands and created this initiative. It passed. And part of that was to turn back the clock on assessed value. And it had assessed value reset at 90% of the 95-96 value. So what ended up happening is that Measure 47, when it came down to it, was frankly, it was unworkable. There were things about it, not the things in the bullets here, because that's the current law, but there were other things about it that really wouldn't work in practice when you were working with the assessors and trying to work through how this would actually work in practicality. It wouldn't. So the legislature got together and they took Measure 47 and the primary tenets that it was trying to impose, and then came up with Measure 50, which then got in front of the voters and then passed. So 47 actually doesn't exist anymore. It was replaced by Measure 50. And you can see the dates up here. Measure 5 was 1990, Measure 47 in 96, Measure 50 in 97. The interesting part about these two tax measures is that they are concurrent, and they are each one did not revoke the other. They act concurrently. So both are are put in place to limit property taxes, and they both work at the same time. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, the permanent rate was established by Measure 47 and 50 in 1997. Our rate, as I previously said, is 3.6665 per thousand of assessed value. Again, we have no mechanism to increase our permanent rate. We do have a local option levy that has afforded us the ability to increase our service levels, and I'll talk about that in a few more slides. Must be voter approved, and you're in front of the voters every 5 years for an operating levy and every 10 for a capital levy. What is interesting about this, and I think is important to note, a few years ago, and time is kind of warped now, but the Tualatin Soil and Conservation District, they created a new district. So you can go to the voters and you can create a new entity and create a new permanent rate for that entity. But you cannot, as a city of Hillsboro or city of Beaverton, increase your permanent rate under the current law. So, and I'll get into compression a little bit. Measure 5 created what's called compression. And when a permanent rate is a new permanent rate takes precedent over a local option
I have a
levy.
question.
And yes.
Sorry, could you repeat that? So when if there's a new district made, then what is the option? Because the law is for all of Oregon, right? But what can be sorry, can you repeat that?
I certainly can. Again, what I didn't say earlier is we could do a whole session on property taxes in Oregon, and maybe at some point we should. So I only have a few slides to talk about property taxes because again, we could probably be here all night. But to go backwards, a permanent rate is a rate that was established under Measure 50,
Yes.
under originally 47 and then 50. We were all the levies and everything that were in the system at that time went into this black box at the state of Oregon, and a permanent rate came out the other side. So we had our established rate, but I don't know if I would call it a loophole, but there is a way for new entities to establish themselves by voter approval and create a permanent rate. Does
Which
that
would
make
be
sense?
different from the 3.66.
Because they're a new entity, they didn't
Interesting.
previously exist.
Okay, very, very.
And the
interesting.
example I used was the Tualatin Soil and
Yes.
Conservation, and it's a very small amount. I think it's like 8 cents is their permanent rate. It's not substantial.
Yeah.
It just gives you an idea that could happen.
And the
has happened.
annual, the assessed value rule would still apply though to that new entity.
Yes, meaning would they be limited?
Yes, would they be limited? Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Wait,
Thank
would
you.
they be limited to what?
So the 3%
They're held at the 3.66.
no,
No, the
So-
3%.
Yeah, so
That's
under
different,
Measure
yeah.
50, if they're in a tax code that is not growing, so if their assessed value is not growing more than 3% because there's no new construction, then they would be limited to 3% growth in their assessed value in any given year.
Yeah.
Unless there is new construction,
Okay.
or say the city of Hillsboro or some other entity increase their local option levy. So if you're talking to your constituents and your constituents say to you, hey, why did my property taxes go up more than 3%? I didn't have any new construction. I didn't do anything else to my house. It's because of things that are voter approved that can increase your property taxes more than 3%. Does that
Yes.
make sense?
And new entities can't, like the 3% rule applies to new entities that they're not exempt. Just the rate is, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
So the annual increase in permanent rate tax revenues is dependent on the growth in NAV. That's really important. And service levels funded by permanent rates, they are deteriorating over time as the percent. We've all seen how much inflation is going up. Well, if you're talking about inflation going up at 5% or 6%, and then, when I'm saying inflation, I know inflation is coming down, but our medical rates, they're going up double digit every year. Our PERS rates have also gone up substantially. We're paying more in wages. So 3% is not allowing us to keep pace with our expenditures. So in other words, we rely on growth to help us cover some of those costs and also to build our tax base and create, livable conditions with high-paying jobs. Go ahead.
I just think that's a really key point, right? Is that we rely on growth in order to keep up with inflation while we're being held back with the 3%. So if we have 8% inflation, for example, and we can only grow by 3%, we're in the negative.
We're in the negative,
Yeah.
correct. And the last point on the left of this slide, really, every person, every entity I talked to, and I just got off the phone a couple of days ago with, we call them the Oregon 7, which is cities about our size in the state of Oregon. There's not a single city that's not dealing with a double-digit deficit for this next annual budget or biennium budget. And I think it's all just kind of rearing its ugly head right now because of the high inflation that we've seen over the last few years, where we're really starting to really see the limitations of the property tax system and its impact on taxing jurisdictions. Go ahead, Robbie.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, and they may touch on this later, and we have an entire other work session where we're going to talk about land use and planning. But when you take what you just heard and you compare that with how difficult it is to grow in Oregon, right? And that's the way that the land use system is set up. That's why there's such a conflict in Oregon, right? Cities rely on growth to be able to pay for these essential services, and yet growing in Oregon is really, really hard to do. And it's set up for a variety of reasons, but that's why you constantly are hearing about land use challenges and budget. They kind of go hand in hand sometimes.
One question on the special districts or entities, is that geography based? So you wouldn't be able to like.
Christian, do you mind, sorry, Councilor Salgado, do you mind using the mic? Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, just a point of clarification on the special jurisdiction or, sorry, entity. Is it geography based, the district, or can it be like
Yes.
houses with cul-de-sacs?
So so I'll use the
Let's do that.
involved in soil and conservation. Yes, so they had a perimeter,
Mhm.
a boundary that tax would, that the folks voting in that jurisdiction could vote for or not vote for, and they ended up voting for it. I don't know exactly what that boundary is for that particular tax, but I will let you.
Yeah, for the local jurisdictions, they all have a defined boundary. So for the city of Hillsboro, for example, with our rate is our city limit. So when we annex new properties, they also come into the city to be under city zoning and able to be served by city services. They also then change their tax code to also be part of that city rate. So that's an example of that geographic boundary for all those local jurisdictions Suzanne's talking about with the property tax side.
I would encourage you to look at your property tax bill. It's a wealth of information. If you haven't already looked at it, yes, please. Thank you. So just really quickly, this is if you want to geek out, look at your property tax bill. But it's good to know what you're paying for. So this is an example of a tax code in the city of Hillsboro. There are multiple tax codes in the city of Hillsboro, but this is all the overlapping jurisdictions within this particular tax code that I showed. And the reason I'm showing this is to give you some idea of the Measure 5 impact that creates what's called compression. So compression is created when schools rates are over $5 and when the government rate, and I've circled both of those, is over $10. So you can see in this tax code that isn't the case. And it is really reflected, it happens when so if you were to calculate your taxes using real market value and using those two caps, and that tax was less than it is when you use the actual tax rates and the AV, then you pay the lesser of the two. And that creates what's called compression. It's a complicated thing. Think about being the assessor and having to do this on a property by property basis. It's not multiple, it's property by property. So you could be one house living right next to another house that maybe was built a little earlier or later than yours, and your house could be in compression and you're not paying as much in taxes on a say a local option levy as your neighbor. So it's very disparate. It can really have different neighborhoods can really be paying different amounts in property taxes for a house that could sell for approximately the same amount. The next slide shows an example of a tax code in the city of Beaverton. And you can see, sorry, the headings are missing on this, but the school one, which is the one right next to the names of the taxing jurisdictions, is over $6. And the government is over almost up to $12. What I didn't say on the previous side is the total compression in the city of Hillsboro for 2024-25 was $2,800. We're good on that for now. But as folks like the city of Hillsboro or maybe Washington County or other entities look at increasing their local option levies, or maybe another taxing jurisdiction comes in with a new permanent rate, that gets us closer to those Measure 5 caps and potentially puts us into compression. But right now, the city of Hillsboro is in a good place in terms of compression. We have very little, just in terms of just looping back and closing out compression for Hillsboro and for how it works. Local option levies, those things that you vote yes or no on, because you're not voting yes or no on your permanent rate anymore. That's established. But the thing that comes in front of you every 5 years that you're voting yes or no on is the first thing to get compressed out if you are in a compression situation. And they're compressed out proportionately. And then ultimately they could be entirely compressed out. And then if compression still exists, then it would start hitting the permanent rate.
So Suzanne, is it fair to say, just with this piece of compression, some of the key takeaways are if we see property values starting to stagnate or reduce, recessionary periods, things like that, that is where the risk and the impacts of compression to us as a local taxing jurisdiction increase more so?
Yeah, in 2008, in the Great Recession, this happened a lot. Real markets values were dipping below assessed values because typically the assessed value is significantly lower on average than the real market value. But during the Great Recession, real market values took a big hit. People like myself voted yes for a levy in Beaverton schools, and then my tax bill didn't reflect it and I didn't have to pay it. I made a big donation that year. It's just how funky that can be property by property. Go ahead, Robbie.
I just add too, when you'll hear me often talk about Hillsboro being a full service city, this is one of the best ways to visualize that, right? Comparing us with a city like Beaverton. So on Beaverton's, you'll see Tualatin Hills Park and Recreation, Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue, Tualatin Valley Water District. You won't see those on Hillsboro's because that's all rolled up under the city's rate. So we are a full service city, whereas other cities, many cities in Oregon, utilize special service districts, which also means it comes with a different taxing jurisdiction.
Does compression add to what sounds like it does the financial situation of a city or an entity? So, for example, Beaverton is $9 million in the hole. Washington County's $20.1 million in the hole. Does that add to it? Sounds like it adds to it.
So oftentimes we'll hear from our peers, if they're going out for a local option levy, they will do their best to calculate how they'll be impacted by compression. And they will need to size that local option levy to account for the impacts of compression. So they may have to go out for, I'll use the city of Hillsboro as an example. Maybe they were trying to raise $1.70. Well, I won't use city of Hillsboro. Maybe they're trying to raise $20 million a year, but they know that $5 million of that will be compressed out based on what they see with their real market value compared to their assessed value. So they actually need to go out for a levy, a rate that produces $25 million
to make up for that.
to make up for the 5 that they're not going to see, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Susan, how does the transportation utilities fee play into this or compare to? How does that work?
So
Comparison.
this is simply the general fund. So this is just all, right now we're talking about one revenue source. We're going to talk a little bit more about some other ones.
Think of the process of it.
Yeah, so this represents about 68% of the general fund revenues right here. What we're talking about is property taxes. The transportation utility fee goes into the transportation fund and obviously funds the maintenance of our roadways.
Right.
We're not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight. I actually don't have a slide on those rates at all, other than a slide that shows you how much utility charges are in the pie of all of our rates, of all of our income.
And the reason I ask is I think it's very confusing to our residents, the difference between the two when they look at their taxes and fees and how that transitions per the area, new growth. So that's why I ask.
So generally speaking, some of our property taxes go for transportation planning and for some other planning, community development planning, but not for actual overlay or actual construction. That's where your transportation utility fee would come into play.
Okay, thank you.
So moving on. So this is a short video that we put together a few years ago talking about the budget process. We may or may not show this again in February. I just thought we're not going to go and do a deep dive on the budget process itself tonight, but this is kind of a quick overview.
What is a budget? A budget is a plan to use existing resources and new money that comes in on specific projects, activities, and equipment. By law, the city's budget must balance, with money coming in equaling money going out. Expenditures cannot exceed resources in the budget. The operating and capital budgets are two key components that make up the city's budget. The city's operating budget is like your regular household bills, including groceries, utilities, and gas. The city's actual operating budget consists of routine operating and public services, such as public safety, community services, and public utilities. The capital budget is similar to your major life expenses, like buying a home or a vehicle. The city's capital budget is composed of large expenses like infrastructure, vehicles, water and sewer main replacement, and upgrades to or construction of buildings and roads. The city's main sources of revenue are property taxes and utility fees. Hillsboro's budget process. During budget preparation, each city department prepares and submits their department budget and updates their planned spending needs. Budgets for each department are then reviewed by the city's executive staff, and a proposed budget is prepared for the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee is made up of the 7 Hillsboro City Council members, as well as 7 appointed members of the community. The Budget Committee then reviews the proposed budget during a public meeting, where public comment is also considered. The Budget Committee will then vote to approve the proposed budget as is, or with any additions or deletions. Once approved, it will move on to the City Council for the final step. The approved budget is presented during a public hearing, where the City Council considers community feedback on the budget. The City Council then votes to adopt the budget either as is or with any additions or deletions within certain budget law parameters. After adoption, the budget is reviewed and amended by the City Council on an ongoing basis. The city adopts a biennial budget, which goes into effect on July 1st and ends June 30th of the second calendar year. So why does the budget matter? Beyond the legal requirements, the adopted budget works as a roadmap for the city to deliver essential services and infrastructure in alignment with City Council goals and community needs. It also formalizes the city's commitment to maintain a resilient financial position to be able to continue to preserve and enhance its services to the community.
So we had that professionally done, not at a huge exorbitant cost by any means, but we thought it would be really good for the public. It's out on our website, and it's kind of, I don't remember if you guys, the bill on Capitol Hill, does anybody remember that? That's kind of what we were thinking about when we put that together. I am going to go back 2 slides just really fast because there was something I didn't say here. The compression in the city of Beaverton was almost 90,000, but when you layered over THPRD and TVFNR, they had another 1.4 million in compression. So they were, I would say that's pretty significant, 1.4 million in compression. I just wanted to note that compared to what the city of Hillsboro's compression was. Let's see. Okay, so now we are going to we're going to talk at the kind of just at the very high level state, and then kind of feed down into the city's total budget and then the general fund budget. I'm not a budget expert at the state level, but I did pull these couple pie charts out from the state's budget. And I wanted to just kind of show for purposes of the state how they're funded. And they're funded primarily from income taxes, lottery funds, and federal funds. And on the left here is their total biennium budget for 23-25, which was $121 billion. And these, the pieces of the pie are obviously where the expenditures are. Human services is very large, and I dug a little bit to try to figure out why it was so significant. I think the public employment retirement system is living in that number, and I think that's why it takes up such a large portion of the pie there. On the right side is the general fund and lottery fund, which is $33.5 billion. And again, you can see the breakout there of where the money is expended. Let me just show, no, it's going to do it on mine now. Hold on. Let me find my notes here. No, state still. So I think what's important to note here is how schools are funded. Schools 66% of the school funding comes from the state income taxes, and 34% come from local property taxes. The reverse was the case prior to limitations imposed by Measure 5. So prior to Measure 5, the majority of funding for our school system came from local property taxes, and Measure 5 reversed that. So now property taxes fund about, like I said, 34%. State taxes to schools are allocated on a per student basis. So they look at the enrollment, and each student within a school gets a certain allotment of funding on an annual basis. And the state's school fund for this biennium was $10.2 billion. And on top of that is what's funded locally at the local level, which is the property taxes. So the state school funds 10.2, and then locally the property taxes come into that number to get to the total budget. I wanted to share what the city receives from the state in terms of revenue. We receive approximately $2.9 million. That includes liquor tax, cigarette tax, and general state revenue sharing. And all of this goes into our city's general fund. The city also receives a share of gas tax and vehicle registration fees from the state that goes into the city's transportation fund to help maintain the city's road network. The city is also the recipient of various state grants. Some are recurring, and some that the city applies for related to transportation, public infrastructure, or more. The city also pays the state of Oregon for various things like our contributions to the public employee retirement system on behalf of our employees. So money is flowing both directions. Now, next slide, please. So this slide is just looking at the total city budget. So now we talked about the state, now we're down at the city. We had a almost $9 billion biennium budget that we asked the city council to adopt back almost, I guess, a year and a half ago now. And you can see, looking at the slide on the pie on the left, where the money was distributed throughout the budget. The majority is in the general fund at 19.6%. And our water funds at 21.1%. Water funds are taking a very significant portion of the pie because of the Willamette Water Supply Program, which you've all heard us talk about a lot. But there's a very significant capital component living in that 21%. And that will shrink down as that comes online in 2026. The right side of this pie is the general funds, and that includes not just solely the general fund, but also a few other funds that are categorized as general funds for our financial statement purposes. You can see the majority of the pie is going towards police, and of course fire and parks and recreation are the largest pieces of the pie there. Next slide, please. So where does the money come from? On the left, utility charges make up about 12%. That's where the transportation utility fee would live. Property taxes. Now I'm looking at the pie as a whole. So when we get to the general fund, you'll see the property taxes make up a much larger percentage, but down below you can see property taxes, when you're looking at the entire budget, makes up around 11% of the total resources coming in to fund the city of Hillsboro. We have a strategic investment program revenue, which we're going to specifically talk about this evening. Grants and donations, we have 2 joint ventures. You can see kind of all of those revenue sources on the left. And then where does the money go? It is public safety is 9% when you look at the total budget. A big chunk of that is community development. That's going to be our water utility, our storm and sanitary sewer utility system. It's also, I believe, trying to remember if Highlight is in CDD or not. And it also includes, of course, our building folks and everybody in community development, including our planning folks and transportation folks. Next slide, please. Now, this is just simply looking at the general fund, and these are the resources coming into the general fund. And this is where I was indicating that 68% of our general fund is reliant on property taxes. And that 68% includes our local option levy, and it also includes our share of Washington County WCCLS that we receive through Washington County, but is actually property taxes just pass through to us. Franchise fees are our second largest revenue source in the general fund. Franchise fees are basically a pay-to-play for using the city's right-of-way, for having pipes in the road and in the roadway system. Portland General Electric, Northwest Natural Gas, all of our garbage haulers. The city of Hillsboro also pays franchise fees to ourselves. So our sewer fund pays our general fund because we are also in the right-of-way. So that is our second largest revenue source. I talked about state and county shared revenues earlier. We have some parks revenues, and then other is a mishmash, including interest. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry.
It's okay, I don't want to interrupt. Keep going.
This is where the funding goes. The majority, as you would expect, goes to public safety, fire, and police. With police is our largest department in terms of full-time FTE in the city. So 33% of the general fund resources go to our police department. Second, of course, is fire, and then parks and recreation and library. Next slide.
Court is 0.
Court did it. It's not really 0. It looks, I should have fixed that. My apologies. And municipal court is under me, and they would not appreciate that at all. So we'll fix that one for the next time we present this. But it is actually a fairly small budget. So we've already talked about the local option levy several times here this evening, but I think it's important to just kind of step back to where we were after Measure 50 passed. We knew we had this permanent rate. We looked at our service levels, and we brought many service level scenarios to our city council, and they did not think that permanent rate at that time was adequate to not only maintain, but to actually improve our service level. So we got out and in front of the voters in November of '98 and passed our first local option levy at $1.10 per thousand. And we did that twice. And then it was time to take a fresh look at the local option levy, and that was when we increased the ask of our voters to go to $1.72. We had the majority of the first levy went more towards police, and at this time we needed to augment some of the costs associated with fire. Was the primary reason for the larger jump in that third outing to re-up the levy. And so we've been at it 6 times. We will be back in front of the voters on either 25, 26, or 26, 27. And this is where we live until there's changes to our property tax system potentially in the future.
Suzanne, I'm sorry if you just said it. Did you tell them the approval rate?
I did not.
The last couple.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, that would be great, actually. 'Cause
Yes.
it was 80 something.
83, it was just under 83, 82.7.
That's right.
Yes.
So the last 2 times we've gone out, we've been in that 82, 83%. I just want to call that out because our community has been tremendous in supporting, especially supporting our public safety levies, which has been extremely helpful.
And I think it was pretty close to that the time before as well. I can't remember. I have a slide, and I'll provide that in February because we have one for, I think, all of the levies.
I have a question. So for the 6th 5-year one, that it doesn't have a dollar amount because we haven't done it yet.
No, we have.
So-
It's just missing it.
Oh,
But thank you for pointing that
sorry.
out.
I didn't mean to do that.
No.
Okay, yes, because
I'm
it's so,
teasing. It should be $1.72.
it is a dollar. Okay.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna go, and you said go back in 26, 27 for the next
For the
5
next
year,
levy.
if needed. Yes. Okay.
Yes. So I'm sure you will hear a lot about it. We'll have a presentation in front of you all talking about that, and we'll be looking at our options for that levy. We're already meeting on it internally now.
Councilor, remember you said we would go out again if needed. It's needed. So we'll go out again.
Susan, when it was looking at, you're fine, a couple slides back, when it was looking at city and county revenue, is that under SIP that is measured out at?
Are you looking at this slide?
No, one more forward.
One more? No, this way. There,
One more.
one more, okay.
Investment.
This one?
That one.
So SIP is in it, comes into a different fund. Our strategic investment program revenue has a separate fund that we track. We track 64 separate funds like little businesses. And we have historically, intentionally kept our strategic investment program revenue out of the general fund so that we didn't become reliant on it for regular operating revenues. We've been able to put, and we have a slide on, several slides on this later in the presentation, where we've been able to put and leverage our SIP, frankly, into bricks and mortar. That we're sitting in one of the buildings as we speak. So we have a slide, and we'll go through all that. So this slide shows you that talked about how important the assessed value is to the city of Hillsboro and to our tax base, and to frankly, our livability within the city. So we have been very successful intentionally of growing a tax base that is exceeding that 3% annually. And you can see that for the last 6 years, we've been above 3% quite substantially. You can see a few little weird blips in there, and I'm going to explain each of those. So back in 2012, 13, we were still kind of coming out of the Great Recession. And this stuff lags behind. We had a very significant property tax appeal in that year. It hit us. We were blindsided with a 0.33% increase. We were not prepared for that. We fortunately had reserve targets and policies that make sure that we have landing space in case something like that were to happen, and it did. And we did not have to make any significant changes as a result of that. In 15, 16, that is when the 1999 Strategic Investment Program came out of abatement and back on the tax rolls. And we're going to talk a lot about those programs if I ever let Dan talk tonight. And that $900 million came back on the tax rolls in that year. Obviously very significant from a growth in AV perspective. We very happy to take that growth in AV. You can see a couple years later in 18, 19, and I might have showed this when we did our orientation. I think I did. In 18, 19, we felt the effects of some of that. So that $900 million that came back on the tax rolls was mostly machinery and equipment, and it accelerates rapidly. Hence why depreciates. What did I say? Accelerates, depreciates, totally different. Depreciates rapidly, has accelerated depreciation, I think is what I was going to say. And we felt that a couple of years later. Fortunately, it did not go into the negative. But since then, we've been staying the last 4 years above 5%. A lot of it has to do with South Hillsboro, a little bit with North Hillsboro, but most of North Hillsboro is segregated into the urban renewal district that we're going to talk about tonight as well. So you're not seeing those numbers reflected here.
So the things that go in it, so homes also are part of this, but they can only grow 3%. Ah.
So homes can actually grow more than 3% if they do any major renovations.
Yes.
But
yes.
typically your
Or new
average home
development.
is going to grow 3%.
Yes. Okay, that's very cool.
Save my house.
I am going to let Dan talk here. So unique to Hillsboro, we are reliant on 2 local option levies. So we have the city's $1.72 for public safety and parks maintenance. And then we have the WCCLS levy, that's 22 cents. We have no outstanding general obligation bonds. I've been here almost 30 years. We've never had any general obligation bonds in my tenure here. And there's a reason for that. And we're going to talk about that. And that's that SIP discussion that we started having, and we're going to have it further in slides later in the presentation. We have 3 active strategic investment program agreements, 2 with Intel and 1 with Genentech. Because we have active SIP agreements, we also have gain share. You can have an SIP agreement without gain share, but you can't have gain share without an SIP agreement. We have 3 active enterprise zones that have boundaries around them. Many companies have taken advantage of those. I don't have the number of companies, but we've had several in abatement at any given time. And we have 2 urban renewal districts, both North Hillsboro and downtown.
So we are going to pull a quick audible, given that it's 6:50. So Mayor Pace and Council, if you don't mind, we had planned to cover quickly our economic development approach to target industries to kind of align with a little bit what you heard in the budget presentation. But this is a nice break point, maybe to end this portion of the work session, and we can entertain a few minutes of any additional questions on that part, and then pick back up post council if you're okay with that.
That works great. Thanks.
I just have like a general question. So, so measures 5 and 50, why don't we have them as part of our legislative agenda for, like, why doesn't that happen? Because I think the appetite is different now than it was in the 90s.
It's a really good question. And I can tell you that almost every year this comes up by most cities and counties that would love to have some type of property tax reform.
Yeah.
The challenge comes in when it's just a very, I would say, very complex and not a very politically palatable thing to try to do, because it's there's been some attempts, I think, to try to get this as a legislative priority. There's just never been any traction at the actual legislature to do it.
Have there been recent attempts? Because I feel like it has changed.
Yeah.
The makeup has changed.
So the League of Oregon Cities that you're all familiar with, they I would say talk about this about every year, and there's just a disconnect between what cities and counties want to do, and not just cities and counties. I would argue there's probably lots of other, I won't speak for school districts, but there's probably a hope there that they could change things. There's just never been any momentum at the state level, any appetite to take this on.
Yeah.
So we would push it if we ever felt like there was an opportunity. We would love to jump on board, but there's never been any kind of opportunity to try to get involved. So,
All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mayor Pace and Council. This will be the second part of the work session this evening. And where I really want to start us off is where we left off at the end of the first part of the work session, which Suzanne made a statement to the effect of you can't have gain share, for example, without SIP. And I want to take that one step further now, where we shift our focus a little bit from straight public finance and budget, definitely keeping that in mind, but to shed a little bit of light of why the city also takes certain economic development initiatives and priorities the way we do. Because I'll take that thought one step further. You can't have gain share without SIP. You can't have SIP without major employers. And we'll talk about that then underpins. You can't have major employers or those robust economy if we don't have some clarity around what are our economic development priorities and goals. So with that, and we covered some of this in the initial council orientation, but my hope is that some of this you might see it a second time, or some of it will be new. But really to just reframe, very generally speaking, why does the city do economic development? And it really is the top 3 things on this slide. It's to seek to provide economic stability through a variety of different industry development and diversification of that industry. And I don't mean industry necessarily like in a smokestack standpoint. What I'm talking about is different types of businesses and industries being here in our local economy, contributing in a variety of ways we'll talk about here in just a minute. A second key reason is to create jobs with a range of wages, because it is those wages that, especially the working portions of our community, that's how they make their livelihoods and their incomes, and can afford to pay their property taxes, like you heard before, pay for utility fees, let alone pay for other things that they want, whether it's going to a Hops game or enjoying an activity here in town, or supporting our small businesses. And so we really focus on creating jobs and wages for the benefit of the residents here. And then thirdly is we focus basically on a financial sustainability, whereas we are a public organization, but we're also a public corporation. We have to find ways to try to be as financially sustainable as we can, especially given some of the parameters that Suzanne talked about in the first part of the meeting. So we do seek to try to maximize the ways in which we can try to generate tax revenues. That's not to say we just want high taxes. That's very different. This is to try to generate different revenues aligned with those structures that we talked about to underpin our operations and continue to support that ongoing notion of how do we continue to provide services. And some of that is in the current structure, especially, it does require and rely upon a certain degree of growth. And then how are we being mindful and smart in that growth? And I'll come back to that because that's a core economic development piece. But if you think about it, and we'll talk about this more in the next slide, property tax and sale taxes. If you were in California, you would see an economic development strategy that might be very focused on retail sales. Let's bring in a Walmart or an IKEA. That's a big boom because there's a sales tax coming off of that helps to support that. Whereas in Oregon, not to say we wouldn't necessarily want an IKEA or something like that, but we don't see as much of a direct revenue benefit to that third category purely because there's something that's selling very expensive things or selling a high volume of things here in our community. So that is one of those kind of more high level examples of the difference of economic development approaches. If we were sitting somewhere in, say, a state like California with the sales tax versus here in Oregon, we do focus a bit more on what things generate greater property taxes and what things generate greater wages because we're very reliant on income taxes and property taxes, as Suzanne mentioned. So as part of that, another key foundational piece we wanted to come back and reiterate around our economic development strategy is a very strong focus around what we refer to as traded sector industries. And we wanted to talk a little bit about why are they targeted. So not to go into full quick economics 101, but traded sector industries really are those businesses and industries that make a good or a product here that is then sold or consumed somewhere else. It's a way to actually grow and bring an influx of economic activity and wealth into the region. And a way to think about that is if somebody from outside is paying a company or an entity here to make something, that dollar comes into our economy and then starts to be spread around. That's a traded sector. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a primary job. It's also why we focus on a lot of those. That will help drive and determine the economic diversity and opportunities when we think about oftentimes service sector is kind of a comparative to traded sector. Service sectors are very important as well. Nurses or in the healthcare industries, for example, or think about, a barber or a hairstylist or a banker. Those aren't necessarily bringing in dollars from the outside in. Those are helping to maintain an economy. Whereas a traded sector entity that is creating goods and products that are getting exported outside helps to grow and determine your economy. And that becomes important for economic growth, for economic sustainability. It also will become important as we talk about some of these types of industries, the nature of how they operate and what does that mean for economic resiliency for us. And so I think it's just really important as you'll see some of the very intentional steps we take in terms of targeting industries. We talk a lot and focus a lot on traded sector, not because they're more important or we don't care about things like construction industry. It's because the traded sector is a big determinant of what can be our economic strength and viability. Whereas service sector, if there's no traded sector, the barber is paying the banker for the groceries that, or for their piece. The banker is buying the groceries and paying the grocer to then go get a haircut with the barber. That same dollar goes around. It becomes far more difficult to grow the economy and therefore be able to grow wealth and take on some of our other initiatives around increased wealth building, especially for certain populations or trying to uplift, undereducated individuals maybe in the community to access good paying jobs and those other pieces. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's a big piece of, you'll see those bullets down below, but the traded sector industries become a focus because of that driving piece. And we still do a lot of work, as we'll talk about too, in terms of service sector or secondary jobs as well. So the four main target industries, and these have been generally our target industries for many years. They ebb and flow a little bit depending on market activity and strength and different investments we're seeing, but are these four. And these are, just to reiterate, traded sector industries. These are entities making goods or products here in Hillsboro that then are maybe sold here in Hillsboro, but more likely then exported outside as well. One that I think most people associate with our community is the computer and electronics manufacturing space. And so this ranges from everything from semiconductor integrated circuits for chips. Think of entities like Intel or Gyra Semiconductor or Qorvo, all here making those components And those entities become very important because they require significant supply chains, bringing in other traded sector companies also to locate here. So a Corvo will have tools made by other companies coming into their facilities. Those companies then may also come to locate here. This is especially true with Intel and its ecosystem. And so that is driving now multiple rings of activity just around one targeted industry, all of which are generally target industries and all of which are traded sector industries. A second area is software information and technology. And so we will see software companies both in Hillsboro and in the region come. We've seen over the years entities like Salesforce who just very recently started to close down their shop. And so software does expand and contract like many industries can do. Leica is in this category. They use stop motion animation, a lot of different software products ultimately to make movies. But they, from an industry category, fall into this. Entities like Adobe. Adobe is housed here. Adobe also has data centers here. A lot of cybersecurity firms fall into this category and have come, and some stay or some have come and gone from Hillsboro. And this is also where much of our digital infrastructure and data centers start to fall in as well, because some of them are either hosting or supporting some of those software entities directly or indirectly. Some of them become almost an enabling infrastructure of sorts as well, but they are still an industry, oftentimes making investments here in our facility, but it's providing services not only to the Hillsboro area, but broader markets and broader regions. The third in the lower left is advanced manufacturing. So this is manufacturing of other goods. Metafab, for example, does a lot of sheet metal related work, some of which gets tied to the computer electronics industry. So they almost become attached to that industry, but they also span across other industries as well. Davis Tools is a tool manufacturer up in the northern part of Hillsboro. They're manufacturing a variety of different tool components going and being used by all different industries. Some of that product again is sold here, some of it's sold elsewhere. A couple other fun ones in that category is like Wilson Sports or DeMarini Sports, manufacturing bats that are used in the College World Series and the College Softball World Series, and Louisville Slugger, if you've heard of that, right here in Hillsboro, using automated manufacturing processes and shipping them, again, literally all over the country and all over the world. Those fall into that advanced manufacturing category. And then thirdly, and these circles generally correlate to the size and the maturity of those industries, but very loosely. But as we get into the bioscience and medical device space, and so this is where some of our biopharmaceutical companies like Genentech has been here for some time. It's a more of a emerging industry cluster that we're trying to build upon and diversify, but becomes important. Obviously, OHSU's research campus here has induced other activity in and around the medical research space. And then Acumed, which has multiple locations in Hillsboro, is manufacturing medical device and implants for surgeries. Shoulder replacement, ball socket joints and screws that can go in hands or facial surgeries and things like that. And so these become very important, and they're not just kind of randomly selected. We've selected them in large part because in some cases, the supply chains might be very common. So we have gas and chemical companies here that might be here in part because they're supporting the computer electronics semiconductor ecosystem, but some of that same technology or process might actually in some ways maybe support the biotech side. And so we start to see some synergies of, boy, if we can be really strong in this area, some of that same players are in that other industry. How can we leverage that to bring another industry here as well? That also gives diversification. So if the semiconductor industry stumbles or falls, or some key players stumble and fall there, we're not solely reliant on one company or one industry. We can have some resiliency across the board for the tax base, for the job opportunities and the pieces. And so we focus on all these, and then really buttressing all of this, then comes the focus on the service sector, having the trades and the construction jobs, electricians, pipe fitters, welders, to support all of these activities and industries. How do we support that industry as well? But again, that industry is largely reliant on what is or isn't happening in many of these traded sector industries to be vibrant. That's in part that secondary or that service sector role. Same thing, healthcare professionals, being able to provide support here as well. So I wanted to pause there to see if there's any questions on our target industries. I'm hoping that's a bit of a review.
Yes. So, all right, what is the percentage that this of the total output that these 4 circles represent?
A percentage from a total number of jobs or wages or property
So
tax?
I would say output. So cities don't have GDP, or maybe revenue. I'm not sure how you would like, so these sizes represent people?
These sizes generally represent
Or
the
revenue?
amount of
Oh, sorry.
employment
Okay,
made
people.
up of our total employment base in Hillsboro.
Okay, so these are people.
Mhm.
Okay.
And a quick question, do these also represent the tax portion?
No, so the circles don't represent the tax portion. We can come back to that, but it's a great segue, Councilor Sinclair, because some of the reasons why these are target industries is the facilities to support computer electronics industries or advanced manufacturing industry, especially the software and data, and including biotech. They are very capital intensive. So they're not only paying pretty solid
Right.
wages, and they also have a wide range of accessible job positions needing different levels of skill, which can become important for our community. We have members of our community with limited formal education, all the way up to some of the highest concentrations, at least up to this point, of PhDs in certain fields and everything in between. But part of why these are target industries, and Suzanne will talk, I think, a little bit about this more later, these companies make very significant what we call capital investments, meaning they invest in very expensive buildings, very expensive personal property and equipment. You remember that conversation from the slides. So when we think about, okay, we're in a financial environment that is heavily reliant on property taxes that drive our general fund locally in our pieces. If you go to somebody who's not making significant investments, and I don't mean to like pit industries against each other, but take a food cart versus a manufacturing facility, the amount of property tax that would be assessed and generated there is significant. Now, the level of impact at an individual level can also be equally important, but that's why we focus on these industries, because they are very capital intensive, meaning they're investing very expensive buildings, and then they're investing very expensive equipment into those buildings. And one of the key pieces, back to that fixed 3%, every time they replace the equipment in those buildings, that is giving a chance to reset the tax base to current values rather than what was the value when they started the company or built that building, 15 years ago. Kind of back to, I think, some of the parallels being drawn earlier about, okay, if somebody has a home or a triplex that was built 30 years ago, well, that's fantastic. It's still housing 3 households or whatever it is. But from a tax revenue standpoint, that's been capped at 3% growth for 20 years. What are we really collecting today versus our ability to cover? So for those reasons, they create solid jobs. They create a range of jobs with accessibility. That's important. That's also driving state incomes very high, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But it is also locally important for us because those facilities are contributing very directly and in a significant way to our tax base, so long as the industries are active and successful and vibrant and using those facilities. And lastly, it comes down to, we've seen this a little bit with some of the work from home shifts in the marketplace. It's very difficult to take my manufacturing operations and just up and move them to a different locale because a place is no longer cool or feels safe, or their sports team struggling, or the cost of living has jumped up. It is more difficult to do that, which in part gives us a little bit greater degree of economic stability and resilience in its own right. Versus, in some cases, we see software companies as an example. We've got a bunch of laptops and a bunch of people in a co-op space. We can grab those things and we can be off to the next, neat location or trendy location. And also we've just lost them out of our economy almost virtually overnight. Not to mention, even when they're in that co-working space, that's not a huge capital expenditure necessarily hitting our tax bases. So I hope that kind of covers a little bit of both of those questions. We can follow up and we have pretty significant, some of this will come, this is why these 101 sessions are going to build upon each other. Not too far out, we come back with a more complete picture of the economic development operations in the city, where we'll focus in greater depth of our workforce initiatives, our small business initiatives, the different programs, and we can bring back some of those refined numbers that you were asking for,
Yeah.
Councilor Amber.
I think it would be very useful for me to see what these 4 circles, what is their percentage with respect to the city's assessed value, that graph that you had earlier.
So we have a graph coming later that won't talk specifically in terms of these companies individually, but you'll get a sense of what the investment in these companies in the target industries that Dan has been talking about, what that has done overall for our assessed value. Thank you.
I have a quick question. So if you're taking feedback on slides, I really like data visualizations like this. So thank you. And can you give us a list of percentage-wise, how many jobs out of all the jobs available in Hillsboro each sector is providing? So if we do computer and electronics, 23,000 equals X% of jobs in Hillsboro, and do that with every sector that you have listed there, and then any others that you haven't listed, just so it gives us a better picture of.
Yeah, we generally have most of that information. Sometimes it gets rolled up and aggregated in certain ways, but if it's okay with the council on Councilor Salgado, your specific point, maybe we can bring that back in 2 meetings when we come back for the economic development 101 in greater depth on that. This is really to try to show how some of this really seeks to reinforce the city's financial position, but we'll definitely bring both of those pieces back a little bit more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Real quick, if I may, Dan, thank you, Susan, for this presentation. It looks like there's about 30,000 jobs up there altogether. Do you know how many jobs are in Hillsboro? 67?
Total jobs are around 87,000. Now that's been in flux because we've had some pretty big industry highs and lows, especially closing out 2024. So our employment data often is a little bit delayed, but we have historically been in the low to mid 80,000s total citywide employment.
Those are showing about 30,000 jobs. If you aggregate all those, I'd also note that the lower right, 1,100 firms or 44 firms, 1,100 jobs. That's about 25 people on average per job. There are businesses that are bigger than that would fall outside these 4 circles.
And there's a lot, yeah.
Right. And some of those, like my law firm, is a service business you referenced, but we did business in the entire Northwest Oregon area. So there are businesses that draw in dollars from outside Hillsboro that we can't ignore. And I know you're not. I'm just highlighting the fact that these are really important. I agree with all the stuff you're doing, but what makes Hillsboro a great place to live is many of the other businesses that are not included in this graphic. And I understand why your department focuses on these, and I'm not saying you don't focus on others. I was involved in the chamber for many years, and there was a lot of small businesses that did great work here. So I just want to uplift that a little bit as we go through this and we not lose sight.
Yes.
And I hesitate to call this trickle down development, because I think we probably have other programs that are helping the smaller businesses as well.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to highlight that as something that I feel also needs to be discussed at some point.
Great. Councilor Harris, if I may just respond to that briefly, and especially for the sake of just recording and long-term value of this presentation, I want to reiterate a point I made on the previous slide, which is we are highlighting some of these target industries, especially this evening, because of such significant indirect relevance to a few of the programs we're going to talk about in the rest of the piece tonight, and some direct financial impacts. By no means are we saying these are the only industries or businesses we focus on. And at that economic development 101 piece, we will have failed if we do not highlight the full extensive work that both our department does, but also in a lot of collaboration and partnership with a variety of organizations that we'll also talk about, serving all different types of businesses and industry across Hillsboro. Because your point is spot on. Hillsboro's at its best and at its richest from a cultural and economic standpoint when we have vibrancy across traded sector, non-traded sector, service sector, all those different industries, but it does require some attention to all of them being successful and thriving. Just to reiterate, we are emphasizing these tonight because of some of the utility and focus on the programs that are tied to the financials more significantly.
Gotcha. And I know we have limited time, so and I appreciate those comments. Thank you.
So with that, I've been asked to keep it quick. So this would have been where we ended the first work session. Not that we're done for tonight. Sorry, a bit to go. But we wanted to then transition into one of the most significant incentive programs that both the state of Oregon and Hillsboro offers, called the Strategic Investment Program. So we're going to focus on this program first, then we'll get into the Enterprise Zone program, and then we'll get into the urban renewal districts, try to give a quick overview of each. Again, if you have questions on more specifics of this program than maybe we're touching on tonight, we can try to answer it quickly. We can also fold it back into, because as part of the economic development piece, we'll talk more broadly about all the incentive programs, not just these kind of that we think of as like the big three. And we can have some of that conversation tonight. We can definitely follow up and use our time at a future council meeting. But the Strategic Investment Program, this is kind of a key summary of terms, especially if the public or some the council isn't familiar with it, is a property tax abatement or exemption program that typically is state enabled through Oregon revised statute, but really it's the local jurisdictions and the local property taxes that are put on the table as the incentive to the companies, even though it ends up in our case, benefiting the state very significantly and still ends up benefiting us locally. So when we talk about the SIP, that's really what we're talking about here is the Strategic Investment Program, which is that property tax abatement program that can apply to new buildings, new equipment, and systems in those facilities. We'll also talk this evening about gain share. That's a component of the SIP program, and that's a way in which the investment or the incentive give by governments starts to be shared a little bit more between local jurisdictions and the state. It's trying to come back and make whole. And we'll talk more about that. But it really is a distribution of those payroll taxes collected off the jobs created by that SIP project that the state's collecting, and then giving it back to the jurisdictions that are foregoing some property taxes as a result. And then an abatement period, and we'll talk about this in each of the incentives between enterprise zone and SIP, but is really the period of time that the company will receive that tax benefit. And so for the case of SIP, the state statute typically is 15 years, as we'll talk about in a minute. Sometimes that can be negotiated upwards for give and takes between the company, the jurisdictions, and the like. Any thoughts or questions on that before we move on?
For the SIP program, what are the key requirements for a SIP program? Is it I feel like you went over it basically prior to this.
We've got up before. We're actually going to cover in the next couple slides.
Okay.
There is typically a valuation threshold, and then we have in some cases negotiated job production requirements as well tied to that.
On a national and international level.
We'll cover on that in just a minute. So, so this is one where Susan, I'll kind of dovetail this, but really the inception of the SIP came in the early 1990s, late 1980s. So at that time, quickly for a little bit of historical context, Hillsboro was largely defined to historic downtown Hillsboro, in and around where we sit today. There was not a lot of connection to the Portland region through urbanization, but it was also very reliant on the agrarian economy that was surrounding us, dairies and berry farms, and a lot of the prized agriculture that we continue to have surrounding us to this day, and increasingly reliant on the economy that was very Portland-based at the time, which was a variety of shipbuilding and a more urban type of economy. And there was very specific policies put in place by the Council of Time saying, we are a full-service city. We didn't have Measure 5 and 50 yet, but they were looking at different tax structures. And they said, we want to start to plan for a more solid, stable economic base here within Hillsboro. So we're not purely relying on an agricultural economy. And we're also not relying on, at the time, a somewhat seemingly distant Portland economy of what was thriving or not there. That led to a variety of land use plans, ultimately that zoned the areas in and around Intel Romler Acres and also zoned and allowed Aranco Station to come to fruition. This will be part of a little bit of future conversation too. It's where we deployed one of the other tools we'll talk about tonight in urban renewal. But ultimately it started to build an industry base and therefore a diversified tax base that Hillsboro to that point had not yet seen. And that has also enabled a variety of our abilities to support growth and achieve a full service city functionality. But part of why that's also important when we think about economic development as a very competitive space, especially when we're in the traded sector space. We've received some of those news even at the end of last year in terms of what that can look like when our state and our region and our city both win and lose on some key opportunities. But what happened was a significant piece where the SIP program, there was greater alignment and unification at that time of the state coming out of a little bit of a significant decline in the timber industry. Still had the ag industry, but there really wasn't a lot of other industry base there. Tektronix was still in unincorporated Washington County, so we had a little bit of a tech base, but there was alignment between the state and the city and some of the regional efforts to say, we need to bring in some other industries here to try to diversify, to build an economic base for Oregonians. And Hillsboro played a mighty role in that, in having the Romler Acres site ready. And then ultimately Intel came along as a byproduct of them originally landing in Aloha in a very small footprint and seeing the benefits of our workforce and some of our infrastructure and ability. And then we saw biotech start to emerge in these other pieces. One of the big incentives we needed at the time was you can't be investing at the time hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars into facilities where you have a state that is also typically very higher in their property tax base and their income tax base, in part because there's no sales tax. And so this was an initiative and an incentive that was created to basically help cap that and give financial assurance to major facilities that were making capital investments here, recognizing then there would be other economic benefits of the state, but we could not walk in and charge them a full tax bill on that amount because it would not make financial or business sense to them locate in our city or in our state. And so you see that was originally created in 1993. There are job growth requirements through this. The goals too were to sustain and increase Oregon's position as a global competitor, or at that time really trying to emerge further beyond Tektronix. And it was somewhat focused at Intel, and we also used it as Genentech, as we'll talk more about here in a minute. And it was really to address, again, those very capital intensive companies. Now, why do we want those here? We want them here from a local jurisdiction standpoint because they help diversify and drive our economy, create the wages. They also drive significant property tax revenue. So we had to kind of give them kind of the very thing that we rely on, but to get a very substantive capital investment to come here. And so how does it work? There's a minimum investment threshold that varies between about $500 million to $1 billion in investment. There are splits between a rural program for the SIP and an urban program. Hillsboro's actually had both historically. Genentech was a rural SIP program at the time. Intel, our other major SIP, and there's been multiple SIP agreements that we'll talk more about in a minute, has been urban. We talked about the abatement terms, typically 15 years. We'll talk a little bit more about the Intel example here where that actually got negotiated longer. And then there's additional negotiated components that come into play. So for example, we've negotiated that the users pay the property taxes on the shared investment based on the investment side. So it's a way of us trying to still recoup a certain degree of the property tax base for the minimum, but then there's a cap. And so anything above that, we are foregoing the ability to collect property tax on. That's really the incentive and the benefit back to the company, and what seeks to bring us generally onto a financial, more balanced playing field with other competing locations. And then on top of that, and you'll see this kind of as a common term and theme throughout, is there's a charged, what we call community service fee, where that user, that beneficiary of the incentive, pays a fee equal to about 25% or $2.5 million, whichever is greater, of the abated tax amount. So that comes back as well. So it's a way to try to, again, bring certain dollars in still, but it's still also providing a significant upside benefit of capital intensive investments.
And who does that fee go to? Is that split with the county and the city, or is it all the counts, city or the jurisdiction?
Yeah.
So the payments are made by the company to the county, and then they're distributed based on a predetermined allocation. So the city receives approximately, actually all overlapping taxing jurisdictions within the areas where the various campuses are, receive a portion of the community service fee based on their percent of that tax code, if that makes sense.
So is that their pro rata share of the assessment for their normal property tax? Is it like
Yes.
the fire
So
district, the parks? and Rec,
yes.
is that all?
So if your tax rate was 8% for, sorry, $5 of the $10, then you would get that proportional share of the community service fee. And I just want to say too, the community service fee for the two outstanding Intel SIPs are at $2 million, not at 2.5. And the original investment that came on the tax rolls was 100 million versus 150 million. That's because the laws have changed since those since those agreements were put into place.
Director Diaz, and what is for the gains? What is the difference between the gains between rural and urban?
It's really the investment thresholds. It's a $500 million investment threshold in the rural enterprise zone, whereas in a rural SIP versus an urban requires the $1 billion or more. So it really is, I think, anticipating or contemplating that there will be more significant expenditure facilities in urban areas, but there's also opportunities, as we'll show you in a minute, across the state. You see SIPs going into rural areas, oftentimes of a different facility nature. So just to keep us moving to, on the right-hand side here is a little bit of what Suzanne was just referring to, is the total investment costs in terms of what is that initial taxable portion versus those thresholds. And those have changed periodically with legislative bills that go through, or the extension of programs and the like. That's called out in the lower right. We do work with the county, but typically the county is the lead entity as a byproduct of this, because they are the assessing entity as well, but it also is called out in state statute. Local jurisdictions can and often do negotiate additional terms or provisions, and that's done, again, with the company, because I think it's really important, something I probably should have said before we jumped into all these different incentives. Our philosophical approach to incentives isn't corporate welfare, as sometimes people will assert or accuse. We really seek to take communities' objectives and benefits, understand what the industries that we're interested in going after need, and then try to create incentives to say, okay, how do we make ourselves attractive and competitive for the industry where they want to and benefit from investing here, but we're still ensuring we're getting the things that our communities are seeking, whether it be tax revenue, whether it be good paying jobs, whether it be maybe allocated funding towards certain workforce programs. And so you'll see that across these 3 incentive programs as we really seek to try to balance and be very thoughtful and intentional of, okay, the company needs to get a benefit because that's the case to bring them here, but still what benefits are we getting? And it still has to be a bit of a balance, because if we over ask or over demand certain things or really dilute an incentive, the companies can say, great, we'll talk to you, but like over here is offering us, straight cash and tax incentives and other things. How do we balance that out? And so we're constantly revisiting those in our programs, especially in this space.
I have a question. So when it says minimum investment is defined as what? As a building?
Building, personal property and machinery. There's a few different things that can qualify there. So here's typically the process when we see, again, in strategic investment programs, because they are really focused so large, we don't see them a lot. And we especially don't see them a lot back to now the intersection with land use. If you don't have substantial sites for billion-dollar plus types of investments coming in, an Intel Romler Acres, for example, or even a Genentech on a smaller side of that initially when they came in initially under a rural SIP, as we'll talk about in a minute, they ended up subsequently using more the enterprise zone tool, which is a little bit lower threshold tool for subsequent investments. But typically, we would follow a process in coordination with the county and engaging the company that follows something similar to what's on the screen here, where the firm would approach usually our economic development teams or possibly the state saying they're interested in us. They want to start to talk about utilization of this tool, and they want to start to evaluate the commitment requirements and initiate those conversations. And that would start. Then we would start to commence the negotiations. There's a public hearing, there's a public outreach component that's tied to that. And really, this is where the formation of the agreement, here's the incentive versus these additional trade-offs or these parameters, here's the abatement period, here's the investment amounts, things like that, that takes shape in that negotiations window. And then there is a formal approval requirement that ultimately needs to be done by the participating jurisdictional entities and then by our state economic development arm, which is referred to as Business Oregon. And then once those approvals, if they're garnered and achieved, then that would start that benefit period. And, we hopefully are starting to see the investments take shape and move forward.
A quick question, Dan, and maybe Suzanne, either one, but does the abatement apply to real property tax or personal property tax or both?
Yeah, you want to talk about the baseline with the facilities?
Yeah, so the abatement, so the 100 million or 150 million, depending on when the SIP was entered into, is what goes on the tax rolls. And depending on what tax code that is, that will be taxed accordingly. The abatement is what is the fees that are paid in lieu are what is negotiated beyond the community service fee. So the community service fee is set up statutorily, and every company has to pay that community service fee that is under a SIP agreement. But the other fees are negotiated between the parties, which is the company, and in the case of our 3 Intel agreements, the city and Washington County, with Washington County leading those negotiations. So the fee in lieu is what we are negotiating. And what the county and the city have historically done is that in no case will that fee in lieu be less than what they would have paid in full freight had the land and buildings been on the tax rolls. So that has been the policy of the county and the city when we've been negotiating these agreements. It's not required under state statute, but the thinking has been that what we are looking to abate is the extraordinary value of the machinery and equipment that has that very short shelf life, that requires continued reinvestment. That is what we're looking to abate. We're not looking to not have a company pay their full freight on the land and the buildings. Does that answer your question?
No, that was my understanding of the SIP's purpose, because there's extremely expensive equipment that ages out. And because of because of our system of taxing business personal property, it becomes really financially expensive.
Yeah.
And that's what the purpose of the SIP was. And I guess that was my question is, so when you look at a bill, are you abating the personal property tax? Or is there such a thing as we're abating this personal property, but this real property tax? Or is it just, is all the taxes thrown into one bundle and you're saying this was normally what you would pay in personal property, business property and real estate tax?
So there's a negotiated agreement that's been signed by all parties. It actually has a formula
Okay.
within the agreement that basically takes you through what that calculation is to get at what that fee in lieu will be.
So
Um,
there is an allocation as to overall business tax burden.
Yes.
Through the SIP. Okay. All right. Thank you.
If I could just add really quick, if you go back 2 weeks ago, Ariel Nelson, our government relations manager, was here. One of our legislative priorities this year is a fix to something that happened at a couple of sessions ago. Right now, as they mentioned, in a SIP agreement right now, it would be the city, the county, and essentially the business that would come to an agreement. Well, there was a new bill a couple of years ago that happened mainly because of some issues on the east side of the state in Morrow County, if I remember right, that essentially made ports have to be a part of this. Well, we have a port here in Hillsboro, and so inadvertently, now if we were to have an SIP program like discussion or negotiation, the Port of Portland would have to be involved. Well, that was never the intent. So that's why one of the city of Hillsboro's legislative priorities is to fix that so that it can still apply to the Port of Morrow and Morrow County, but it would remove the Port of Portland from being a part of really a discussion that doesn't really affect the Port of Portland.
To directly apply it. And I think just back to close out part of the answer to your question, one of the key takeaways in the SIP conversation is a lot of people think, especially, take an Intel or Genentech, those that are here in Hillsboro, they are making significant investments in the facilities. The land is pretty much the same now. The scale of the land for the size of the campus can differ, but that's the same. It's the nature of the facilities and the systems in them, and then especially the personal property, that equipment Suzanne talked about, that can in some cases be in hundreds of millions of dollars for a single piece of equipment like the size of this room that's going into a facility, and that's what it's targeting. But there's also, I think, oftentimes a misunderstanding when you read about it in the press or whatever, is that those entities are not paying property taxes. And even with the SIP programs applied to them, they are still some of the largest property taxpayers across the county, which affects and includes our portion of the tax rate and, the special districts, if they're applicable and the like. And so that's a key piece back to what we take into account in those negotiations and with some of those community service fee negotiations and that baseline payment piece as well.
And if I could just add to that, Intel is the highest pays the most taxes in all of Washington County outside, we're not considering a SIP agreement. So they are, I think the number was 32 million in the last year. So they are definitely contributing on an annual basis to property taxes that are helping all overlapping taxing jurisdictions within the tax codes of their various campuses.
And so are Intel and Genentech the only two in the SIP agreement with Washington County currently?
Correct. I think you have the presentation because that's a great segue to the next slide. So we put this in, and some of this presentation comes from a joint effort that we did with Washington County a couple years ago, going into a legislative conversation. So you'll see this goes to 2022, but it's still pretty recent numbers, given that we're usually about a year delayed anyways. But yes, Intel and Genentech are the only SIP beneficiaries currently in Washington County. They also happen to fall largely here. Genentech is entirely in Hillsboro. Intel is 3 out of 4 campuses here in Hillsboro. And so you'll see those called out kind of in the reddish, orange, salmon, whatever color that is, take your pick, the non-green color. And you'll see some details there. But part of why we wanted to show this as well is not only to highlight the SIP projects that are in Washington County and therefore also in Hillsboro right now, because those, if it's in Washington County, it's in Hillsboro, but is also to show the SIP programs that are used elsewhere in the state. And then many of the other ones are rural. You'll see a couple other urban ones. But it really gets back to the alignment and the utilization of our incentives to maximize some of those key economic development and revenue sources. And so, Intel, albeit with some of the recent layoffs, are still, I believe the official number I saw is north of 20,000 employees. We know that they have some of the highest average annual wages, and that's why you see Hillsboro's average wage, if you recall from the orientation presentation, we're $10,000 to $15,000 greater than some other cities and counties, even in pretty close proximity to us. That is resulting in significant income taxes being generated down at the state. Genentech as well, while lower employment numbers, also has pretty competitive range of wages there as well, equally providing good jobs into our local area and wages for people living in and visiting our community, but also paying in income taxes at the state. Some of the other projects here, you'll see a pretty significant trend in some of the Morrow areas and eastern parts of the state are important, but a lot of them are very energy focused facilities, still capital intensive in their own right. And while we don't have employment numbers on them, it really goes back to the different needs that some of these incentives can play, and also the different return on the investments that it can have both at the state level and at the city level. So while we don't have full employment numbers, I would venture to say much of those urban SIP programs, especially those that are here in Washington County, make up a substantial portion of the employment numbers and therefore the income numbers that are also benefiting the state. And that's why, as Robbie noted, you will often see different SIP related measures or initiatives on our legislative priorities as we track that program, as people may want to make changes to it, or as gain shares, we'll talk about here in a minute, comes up, because the gain share is a piece back to, as we talked about in the key terms, what share of that income tax that the state's collecting, and then coming back to the local jurisdictions that are affording those property tax abatements and benefits.
I have a question. So Genentech and 2 Intel SIPs, and I'm assuming only one of those Intel would be in Hillsboro.
Both of the Intel, so they're more
Are
of a
in
timing
Hillsboro?
sequence,
Okay.
and there's been 3. We have a slide coming up that talks about the reason why there's only 2 of the 3 is one of them had dropped off just prior to this 2022 timeline. Yeah, but those aren't, think of those not as like one for each site. It's tranches of investments across all of their sites and assets, if that helps.
Yes.
So Dan, will there be a sunset this year with Genentech?
Yes. Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a minute. And one with Intel. Yeah, and we'll this is part of why we're running through these different programs, is at the end, again, tonight is primarily around budget and finance, but these pieces, as you'll see, are significant drivers. Suzanne will talk a little bit more about what that means for us, both with them dropping off, but also if we don't have new SIPs, as she ended the first part of the presentation, you don't have gain share without SIP as well. So if we're not able to grow and have new SIP eligible projects, we may not see significant CapEx projects coming in, and you may not also then see the continued stream of gain share revenues also coming to the city. Is something you wanted to add before I move on? Sorry.
No, I think we're good. So just a little deeper dive on gain share. I think Dan's given a very good overview already, but the idea behind gain share and the concept behind gain share was that it was intended to create a win-win. So as Dan pointed out, here is a city or a county abating taxes locally, property taxes locally, to incentivize a company or companies to come to the city or county and invest, but yet, and then create these amazing high-paying jobs, and then that windfall of income taxes ends up at the state. So it was Washington County that came forward with this concept of gain share, and it actually made it through legislatively back in 2007. I think the folks that were in the fiscal legislative office that were supposed to track the bill and figure out how much this bill would ultimately cost the state might have missed a few zeros. So for 8 years or so, we were receiving whatever was generated. So 50% of revenues from new jobs. So the county and the city, if the company created a new job, 50% of that income tax would go into this calculation. Any retained jobs, 20% of those income taxes would come back locally. That became a little unwieldy for the state, and it was determined that those checks that were having to be cut annually were getting quite sizable, and they took a fresh look at it, and they ended up capping that at 16 million back in 2015. We have reached that cap every year of that. We don't know this for a fact, but we're pretty confident that we are the only SIP in that list that you saw and any that have come after that are actually achieving that cap and getting that full $16 million annually. We receive a little over $6 million of that 16 million, and with the remainder going to primarily to Washington County. And we have historically, for at least for the last many years, been investing that in our highlight. And we've been using that for a pay-as-you-go. We haven't issued any debt related to highlight. We've been using this source of revenue. We've also invested in our schools using this source of revenue to the tune of around $500,000 a year that we've been putting aside. Again, you can't have gain share without an active SIP, and we only will we'll only have one active SIP after this year. We'll talk about that in a few other slides. The company is required to report out by April of each year on new jobs and retained jobs. And then the payment is due in July, and then the county gets the payment, and then we receive our share of that payment. There have been legislative efforts to potentially make gain share not be a going concern. We had it was supposed to go through 24-25, and then it got extended for 1 year, and then another legislative session later, it has been extended out to 30-31. So we should have, sorry, what did I say?
I wish 30-31.
Wow, that would be awesome. 20-30-31, which does also seem quite a ways away, but it really isn't that far away. So it's been a great program in terms of how we've been able to, once again, not put that into operations, but to isolate those funds and use them for to meet community needs, specifically and primarily highlight.
I want to keep us moving, but I do want to just tie together one piece that you may hear come up as you talk with state legislators around some of this work. Is in our world, and when we're working with Ariel and a lot of our government affairs teams, we hear a lot about the state's approach to economic development needs to balance urban and rural benefit and economic development. And sometimes we get perceived in Hillsboro as you already have a lot, or you get enough, or things like that. And it's programs like the SIP, I think, that can demonstrate how we use that here in Hillsboro for a lot of benefit in Hillsboro, but the benefit that is creating that's going to statewide funds, while we're talking gain share, a percentage of that coming back into Washington County, that leaves a very significant percentage that also is now available to go to schools or to programs throughout the entire state, enabling a much broader state strategy. And it sometimes almost appears as though that isn't fully either understood or appreciated when we're in those spaces trying to say, we need SIP support here, or we need to continue to try to grow this industry base and these type of projects here in Hillsboro. In doing so, can still provide benefit to many other parts of Oregon, even though sometimes it may be hard for others to see themselves directly reflected in some of our asks or some of our initiatives as well. So I just wanted to tie that together without getting too much in the politics side, but it becomes a very real and a very important talking piece when we're talking public finance, when we're talking economic development, and when we're talking incentives moving forward.
Director Diaz, and we'll go over this at a later time because it's too much to go into right now. But can we look into what does that look like to bring agrarian economic opportunity here in Hillsboro, even though we don't have rural or forestry reserve, and we can't tax food. So how do we make revenue to create a space at the table for our entities who feel left out of that decision making?
I have that, and I actually think I'll come back to that when we get to one of the other programs. We've done some work recently, Councilor Sinclair, that you're aware of in terms of even supporting our local farmers market, some access to some of our local agricultural pieces out of similar programs, just out of other incentives we'll talk about here in just a minute, and then we can follow up afterwards if we don't fully cover it.
So this is just the cycle of life in an SIP. Oh, sorry. Thank you. The cycle of life related to an SIP and gain share. So it's just trying to have you picture how the money flows. So an SIP abatement is a 15-year agreement with a private firm. They pay that share that we already talked about that goes on the tax rolls. And then they pay any other fees that have been negotiated beyond the community service fee. And then the state collects the income taxes related to those jobs that have been retained and new jobs. And then gain share is then calculated, and that share of gain share up to the cap is then paid back to the local jurisdiction. So I can show you how this works, but I think you've kind of heard that it's just trying to show you how the money is flowing here on this slide.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Active SIPs in Hillsboro since 2015. We have the Intel 2005 SIP. This was a $25 billion cumulative investment for a 15-year abated life. This information is dated. They met that $25 billion in, I believe, 6 years. My next couple slides will show that. This does not, down below, you see the note of the 1999 Intel SIP agreement. So they went from 12.5 billion in 1999. That's what they negotiated with the county and the city. Then they went to 25 billion in 2005. And then the Intel on the far right was a 2014 SIP, which is a $100 billion SIP agreement. It doesn't mean that that Intel or Genentech has to spend a single dime. It just means that if they do, and when they do, that cumulative investment is captured under these agreements and taxed accordingly and abated according to the agreement. It's not the case. They have spent all of the money under the 2005 SIP and the 99 SIP, and Intel is working still their way through the 100 billion on the 2014 SIP, which I will show you here in a second. Intel 2005 and Genentech both sunset. So this year, the year that we're in, which is 24-25, was the last year that they were under abatement. So both of these come out of abatement and come back on the tax rolls, not only of the city of Hillsboro, but the overlapping taxing jurisdictions this coming tax year. One of the big things we'll talk about again, because I believe I talked about this at the orientation, was that this number, what is it going to be? How big is that percent growth going to be in our AV in this next year? And we're banking on a very significant increase in AV, but we're also concerned about what happens a few years later when you see that accelerated depreciation because of that significant investment in machinery and equipment. And I know, Councilor Salgado, I realize you did not get the benefit of that orientation, so we at some point can have that conversation because there's a lot that I'm kind of throwing at you all quickly. Genentech was a much smaller rural investment, but nonetheless, it was and is an SIP, but does sunset. You can go to the next slide. And this is you.
Yeah, so I'm going to hit these very fast. They're in the packet, so you can refer to them. But the key takeaways with these next couple slides is to really then tie back to those different economic development objectives we had at the start of this section. And these are the job creation numbers for SIP projects in Hillsboro, really going back to about 2015. And you can see them roughly color-coded. Intel 2005 SIP being in the dark blue, Genentech's 2006 SIP being in the yellow, and then the Intel 2014 SIP being in the blue. And so you will often hear myself and some of the active team members talk about the but-for argument. But for having this incentive program or the availability of sites for that industry to make the investment, we would not likely be seeing this level of job creation or this level of capital investment or the like. And so these graphs really show, at least within what we know of SIP and the reporting that's there, that we were achieving significant job growth just across these three entities. And what I think it's really important to highlight from a more macroeconomic development standpoint is this isn't capturing that supply chain we talked about. This is only those entities, not the thousands of employees that are also working at other companies in and supporting those, or the attorneys working at law firms here to support those companies, or the barbers, that are also out there, helping to support the overall economy we're building here. Similarly, these are the wages tied back to our SIPs. And so you can see the color coding here is different than the last slide, whereas the Washington County SIP average wage is in the light blue. This is now looking from a more state comparative basis back to that color-coded table with the blue and the reddish orange, whatever that was, in there. So Washington County is in the light blue, and you can see an average wage from about 2015 at 106,000 to 2021 at 137,000. Again, high-paying wages to local area residents, also high-paying income taxes going into the state coffers. You can see the Oregon aggregated average SIP wage in gold. That is substantially lower, although it's grown a bit in recent years, and that's around 89,000. And then you can see the Washington County average wage without SIP and that's in the darker blue. So the key takeaways here is that the SIP, while we're abating property taxes, that incentive is achieving the objectives of significant capital investments, significant job and wage creation, and also significant income tax generation that's largely going to the benefit of the state absent gain share.
Do you know the median wage, or do you know the breakdown as far as high wage and the different wage levels, like
For the city or by these projects?
for the SIP ones?
I would have to break it out. So basically what you're asking is what's the average wage at Intel versus the average wage at Genentech?
No. What's the median wage?
Oh,
for
median
these
wage?
new jobs?
Let
Yeah.
us look into that and see if we can get information and come back to you
Or
with
the
it.
percent, like the top quarter, bottom. I'm just curious as to, they say that you can drown in a river that's on average 5 feet deep, right?
Sure. We will look into that data, see if we can get our hands
Could you
on
tell
it.
me more about what you're asking, Councilor Harris? Yeah, I
Well,
appreciate.
so,
Yeah.
So, so would this graph mean there's a handful of people making $300,000 and other people making 60, or is everybody making exactly 137? So it'll tell you. That's the information I'll tell you, basically.
Yeah, it's a question around statistics and the numbers, and we'll look to see if we can find the median breakouts as well. We typically will use average in many of these type of analysis and presentations. So this next one just builds upon that a little bit more and really seeks to then visually show some of the gain share pieces that Suzanne also talked about. And so in this slide, on the left, first of all, you can just see some key data points about the 675 million. Again, keep in mind that this is roughly through about fiscal year 22. We're in the process of trying to get updated data, and we'll continue to try to keep this updated in time. But about 675 million in income tax revenue to Oregon in that duration. 96 million in gain share revenue coming back to Washington County that then is getting split out across those different taxing districts to the conversation we had earlier, and really accounts for about 11.3% share of the revenue to Washington County, which has decreased. And some of the reason for that decrease, which you now start to see in the bar chart on the right, is you have the state income tax being generated in the dark blue bars. You have the calculated gain share without the cap in the light blue bars. You have the gain share cap that was imposed to what Suzanne presented on a few minutes ago, shown in red. And then you can see the share of the income tax revenue to the county coming back. Now that is decreasing in part because the overall amount of revenue collected at the state is going up and the cap is kicking in. So that while the amount we're receiving is staying capped, the overall share percentage share that we're receiving is actually dropping because the state is seeing more and more monies coming in time. So sometimes that chart throws a few of us for a little bit of a loop, but I thought it's a nice way to kind of really visualize a few different things: the benefit to the state, the importance of gain share coming to us, but also still a little bit of the residual benefit that is staying really with the state as a result of economic activity and the use of these just the SIP incentive here in Hillsboro and Washington County.
So this says 96 million in gain share to Washington County. The cap is 16. So this is the what it would be.
The cumulative.
Oh, this is over the years. Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah, and just, I think someone had asked earlier, made reference to, and see if this pointer actually works. Maybe yes. So this is the $16 million cap,
Yes.
but this would be what the gain share would be had it not been capped.
not
So you
been.
can see how that was concerning, how large that was getting.
Yeah.
And hence why this line looks like that. But the 96 million again is at that point in time. So that's back in 2021. And that I believe is from inception
Yes.
of the program.
I apologize, but why does the share of income tax revenue to the county go down? I missed that. I tried to figure it out all by myself after you explained it.
No worry. It's because it's we believe it's a percent share. So the percent of the income tax revenue that the state is collecting, what percent of the income taxes collected is going back to the county of this program is decreasing because you have more money going to the state, but the cap. So if the state, let me try to give like
Because
round
the cap-
numbers. If the year one is like $1 million and the cap is at 12%, that's what. Help me. Come on,
120.
you need a Excel table, I know, but it's. Thank you.
Just go to the engineer
Versus
over here.
if the next year, if it now goes up to 100 million, but the cap is still there, the percentage that is within the cap is actually decreasing of the total
Of
being
the
collected
total.
that year.
Yeah. Okay. Thank
Sorry,
you.
yeah. It's not like we're getting less money. What it's really showing is that the state is actually making more money and keeping more money as a result of it.
On us.
Yes.
On us, and as wages continue to grow.
Yes.
And that's why we continue to be very motivated to work in partnership with the state around economic development objectives and priorities to continue to see mutual benefit here, hopefully.
Thank you.
So we're wrapping up the SIP piece, just a couple more slides, but again, these will stay in the packet, but Suzanne, you want to hit just the key
Yeah,
high-level takeaway
just really
points?
quick. So I got the pleasure of sitting at the table at the Intel when we negotiated the 2014 SIP. And these were some of the slides that were actually shown. I know they're pretty wordy. I'm really just trying to share the tenets of the agreement and kind of the context of what was being thought at the time. So we wanted to continue the success of the 99 SIP and the 2005 SIP as we were negotiating 14. That was top of mind. This was $100 billion investment. Just to give you some scale on that, our total assessed value in the city of Hillsboro today, this year, is $18.8 billion. Versus what they were looking at investing over a 30-year life of $100 billion.
Can you say that again?
So our current assessed value in the city of Hillsboro is $18.8 billion, and Intel was looking at and has already invested $33 billion of a $100 billion agreement. I'm just trying to give you some scale because I think sometimes that's important to
The
grab
18
some
billion
scale.
is real estate assessed value, correct?
It's all assessed value. So it includes all of our diversified tax base, which includes the industrial sector. It includes personal property. It includes real estate or houses, residential, all of it. You'll see it in a coming slide.
Okay.
At that, so what was unique about this agreement is that, and Dan referred to it earlier, is that it's a 30-year agreement, but it's the abatement period is still only 15 years because that is statutory. But we can have multiple 15-year abatement periods within that 30-year period of time. Right now, we're still on tranche one, abatement number one. The emphasis of that time was equipment replacement, development, and retooling of machinery and equipment, and knowing that they needed to reinvest in new technology every few years. I think the other main thing that's important here is it created a level of certainty for all parties, and that's the bottom bullet. 30 years, we were back at the table. I think they were back at the table negotiating sooner than they wanted to be from the 2005 SIP to the 2014 SIP because of how fast their $25 billion under the 2005 SIP was expended by them. So they wanted more certainty, and that certainty is not just good for Intel; it's good for all of their suppliers and the industry as a whole. We focused on retaining jobs. There was potential for new job creation, but it wasn't a requirement of the agreement. I think those are the biggest ones on there. And then, I mentioned this earlier. One of the primary focuses of the agreement is that they will pay at least full freight on land and buildings through what goes on the tax rolls and through these negotiated fees. But the equipment is what is abated and has a lower assessment in the calculation. Let's see if there's anything else. Provided flexibility with multiple 15-year investment packages. And again, we're still in that first 15-year, and I have a slide that will go through that here. I think it's the next one. Yes. Okay, so this is why I got the pointer. So this was the 1999 SIP. It sunset in 2014-15. That was when you saw that AV slide. That was that $900 million increase we saw in 1 year. They hit that. They spent $12.5 billion in 10 years. That's when they reached 100% of that cumulative investment. And that's where we got the $900 million back on the tax rolls. The 2005 SIP, it kicked off in 10-11. It will sunset this year. They hit the $25 billion investment in 6 years. We are in the 2014 SIP kicked off in 16-17. It will sunset in 31-32. That tranche of that 30-year agreement will sunset in 31-32. It was $100 billion. They've got a cumulative investment to date of $33.9 billion. That's what they've spent to date under this agreement. Their first tranche, which has that 15-year abatement life, was 33 billion, and they had to declare that and let us know what that tranche was going to be. And they've almost spent 100% of that. So likely they'll be kicking off a second tranche of the Intel 2014 SIP. And then here's the Genentech. I don't have the same figures. I don't have the years that they reached their full investment. Next slide. Okay, your turn.
All right, go ahead, please.
Oh, I had a question. So for the three different SIPs, the cumulative, yeah, thank you. So the cumulative investment to date, so the first one, the 12 and a half, and then the second one, the 24, that 12 and a half is not a part of the 24, or no? Okay, thank you.
No, they're separate.
And back to just your earlier question, that's why in that one table they show up as 2 Intel SIP agreements, because these are those different tranches I was alluding to of their tracking. All right, well, that wraps up SIP. Unless there's any final questions there, we'll move into the next one, which is Enterprise Zone, which will be a little bit more abbreviated. And the SIP is pretty extensive in part because it's got that gain share component too. That's a bit unique.
Maybe I'll just very quickly mention, Suzanne talked about this earlier, but the reason why the SIP has been so important to Hillsboro, are you going to talk about this later about what it's paid for? So you are. Okay, never mind.
So this next tool you'll notice is very similar in part to the SIP in that it's a property tax abatement tool. It also is focused primarily to businesses and entities that are making significant capital expenditures, although maybe not quite to the very high thresholds that we saw in the SIP. And so what it's seeking to do is cover similar types of businesses, cover similar types of industry, produce similar types of economic results, but at a little bit lower threshold. And with, you'll see lower investment thresholds, lower abatement periods, and a couple of additional stipulations. So the Enterprise Zone is, again, it's a state-enabled incentive program that then we adopt if we're eligible for at the local level. It's a 100% property tax abatement for up to 5 years on capital assets, which in this case can include new buildings and structures, machinery and equipment, and qualifying personal property. There are core state requirements which require the increase or maintaining of employment by at least 10% for existing companies. And then for new companies coming into the area, the creation of at least one job, we see that coming in. We also look at, in some cases, we will see companies come to Hillsboro maybe that are expanding out of other parts of the region. Maybe they can't stay in a certain location, or they've outgrown that facility and they're still looking for somewhere else to come to. We've seen this with Peterson Caterpillar north of Highway 26, for example. We saw it with Reese's Fine Foods north of Highway 26, just to name a couple. And so if that's the case, then they can't lose those. They still have to account for those jobs in the broader regional ecosystem when they start their new facility and are eligible for this incentive here. Exempt assets must be maintained on the site. So kind of the same thing. We want to see that investment made here, stay here, and eventually it will come back onto the tax rolls, even although it might be at a depreciated in a more limited time frame, depending on refresh rates of the equipment. They enter into a first source hiring agreement that our staff, and I believe Val Alcott is in the audience. She's really our lead and our champion for this. I do want to thank Val for all of her work in this space. But they will enter into first source hiring agreements with WorkSource Oregon, again, really seeking to bring the job creation benefits back to local residents and people. They provide a relatively recent school support fee. So the Enterprise Zone, like the SIP, almost every legislative session, it seems like there are a multitude of bills wanting to add or trim down or kill or extend this program. And so there was a school support fee that was added 2 years ago, I believe. And what that seeks to do is collect the portion of the property taxes abated for the school district. But as you may recall, Suzanne talking about, the state right now, it's a predominant funder school district, but it basically gets paid, but it doesn't go directly to our school districts. It goes to the state for that central funding formula piece and then distributed back out to school districts all across the state. And then it also does require an annual compliance report that our staff, Val, primarily process, where the company has to demonstrate and show the investment is still there, the job thresholds are still met, the hiring agreements are in place, and we also oftentimes will get procurement information and other pieces. So Gyra Semiconductor is an example. Gyra is making semiconductor chips here in Hillsboro, but their facility, their investment thresholds were not quite into the SIP category, but they were right in the sweet spot, even with some of their recent expansions in the Enterprise Zone space. And so they're a participant in this program. Hillsboro and local jurisdictions can then modify and build upon those state requirements I just covered. So we can add minimum wage levels. We can provide benefits to certain employees or training opportunities. In our case, we a couple years back broke out two different investment thresholds versus jobs created, and this is in part because we had some industries that were making massive capital investment and getting this property tax benefit that maybe didn't have as high of job counts associated with them. And so we said, okay, maybe you pay a little bit more back. You don't get as much of a fully realized benefit, in part because we're maybe not achieving quite as much of the job creation or the wage creation, even though we're still seeing very substantive, capital investments coming in. So again, a couple other examples that are in the enterprise zone program on the right here, NTT, which is a global telecommunications firm with some major data center operations in North Hillsboro. AGC is Asahi Glass. They make glass components and materials going into the semiconductor processing piece. So they're part of that semiconductor ecosystem. And then Hitachi High-Tech, another semiconductor tool manufacturer also in the area that is making equipment and tools going into the semiconductor manufacturers as well. To date, there was a question earlier around, okay, what has been the activity in this one? So we do have numbers here. To date, the zone has been active for 18 years. That's included a renewal. We do have to qualify based on eligibility criteria of census tracts and incomes to do that. So that this is something, again, that may not be around forever, and we cannot fully take for granted, both in our economic development incentives toolkit, let alone from a budgeting standpoint. In that 18 years, we've seen 89 applications approved. That's been over 56 companies. And why those numbers don't align is sometimes companies will come back, they may do an additional expansion, or they may come back with a whole new additional round of investments. They can come back, and if they still qualify and meet those job thresholds and those investment thresholds, they can reapply for that. And we see that across different industries. Currently, we have 45 applications approved, 29 companies are involved in that. Which is a total estimated investment of over $9.5 billion in capital investment. So that, again, is facilities, machinery and equipment, personal property, back to some of the questions earlier. The employment created by those projects is right around 3,000 jobs created and added in. The average compensation, and we can try to pull the median on this one as well, but the average compensation across those different jobs created is about $119,000, which is quite close to the Hillsboro average wage across all employees in Hillsboro. And then local procurement. This is a little bit more difficult number to fully track, but we estimate based on the information given us to the companies that about $23 million has been spent by those enterprise zone companies with local procurement. That can be for office supplies and machinery and equipment. It can be for food and coffee. It can be for activities and event venues, but it's a way for us to try to understand a little bit too that benefit and importance of traded sector to service sector, or just the additional induced activity and benefit we're seeing across our full range of industries and businesses here in Hillsboro. And Genentech, as I mentioned earlier, also an enterprise zone participant. So part of their facility and investment package was under that rural SIP, which is about to sunset. The more recent project that came in about 5 years ago, which you see highlighted on the left of this photo, utilized the enterprise zone, and they evaluated both, but really it was the enterprise zone that for their needs and benefit really made the most sense, whereas the SIP, they weren't quite in the space or the threshold where that abatement period or some of those terms made sense for them at that time. The enterprise zone also is an area that we use to fund and do a lot of local economic development, public benefit activity, and we'll talk more about this in that future work session I alluded to earlier. But we collect a community service fee. So the company realizes this tax savings benefit, but a percentage of that savings comes back to the Hillsboro economic development team for targeted use in areas such as workforce development, economic development activities, but especially workforce development. And so we fund things like PCC Future Connect program, something many of you have heard about. That $1.4 million has come from this incentive program. And that's a nice way that we can give back to our community, see individual benefit from the same incentives that that company is also benefiting from and able to locate in Hillsboro as a result. PCC Career Educational piece at $115,000. You see other skill development partnerships like Centro de Prosperidad with Centro Cultural. That $2.5 million has come nearly entirely from the community service fee here in the enterprise zone. Other efforts like Quick Start support, where we did customized semiconductor workforce training. That was funded out of the community service. Adelante Mujeres Cocinemos program, supporting local food entrepreneurs. This is back to where we can tie into some of our locally grown, food products and into small business support. And then you can also see 90,000 support for the Small Business Development Center. So again, this is a way that we focus on all of our industries, but this is enabled because we had the enterprise zone and because we're achieving not only the direct economic benefit of those investments, but we're able to then direct some of this funding into those other community needs and priorities as well.
Just, I think it'd be helpful to talk about the reason we have SIP and the reason we have enterprise zones. Because we have these programs, but they actually serve purposes, right? And the SIP, from what I remember, is maybe not primarily, but largely was a result of the way we were trying to get tech in here and the expensive cost of the equipment, horrendously, really expensive equipment. And we had this business property tax that became an onerous, and it was a barrier to tech moving in here. So we developed this program to defer or abate the taxes that would normally go on there. There's probably a lot of other incentives as well.
But
that's
to attract the businesses,
yeah. To say, we want you in here. We know this is an unfair tax because our system is a little bit unfair. So we're going to fix it this way. Sort of an ad hoc fix to the really high property tax. Enterprise zones, on the other hand, address a different problem. Enterprise zones, from what I remember, and there were about 15 or 18 of them approved throughout the state of Oregon, were focused on census tracts, zones that cities could apply for, because these particular zones had low average household income, high unemployment rates. And so we were encouraging business to go into these zones. So we deferred the property taxes for them. But then there's other payments that were made. So we could, the city or the county or whoever, could go ahead and make these investments in Future Connect and technical education. And that's why you see these investments from the enterprise zones going in these particular projects. So I think it's helpful for us to understand why we have SIPs and why we have enterprise zones. I think it is helpful to understand why we have these. So when we see these directed, we don't say, well, we shouldn't be giving it to Future Connect. Well, yeah, that's exactly what this money is for.
Correct.
Enterprise zone. So I think it's helpful historically to maybe understand that, if I'm right.
You are right. And that's back to why we felt it appropriate that for the first of your one-on-one sessions, that is primarily around public finance and budget. But you can see the intention of these incentive programs we talked about. Some people think of just as a business benefit, but to the point Suzanne and I both made, they're intended to be win-win and advance and drive local opportunities, because without those enterprise zones, not only might we likely not have many of the investments, we might get a few, because there are some companies that will come in and they don't want or need the enterprise owner. Maybe they don't want to be committed to a job reporting or something else. But this funding, if we were still to support this level of community support, is then having to come out of the general fund that is going to be already diminished, because we're probably not seeing the capital intensive investment for the companies using that. It then would potentially compete with public safety funding or other service funding. And Suzanne will talk more about that. But thank you for acknowledging that, because that's a piece where we try to talk about this quite openly and quite thoughtfully, and the intentionality behind it and the win-win-win natures of it, and why we wanted to front load in part of this presentation, even though we'll get into it in far more depth a bit more when we come back and talk exclusively just economic development.
Thank you. I think that's right. And so, and I say that because the city is going to be facing some budget pressures. And I'm glad to hear, and I didn't know that, you sort of have these pots that you allocate these. So I'm glad to know that. And I think we all need to keep that in mind as we start to look at our budgets.
Yeah. Well, and just add two quick things to the timing of this work session. Today was the first day of the legislative session. And as was mentioned, oftentimes you will see bills that go after these programs. Some of them are to enhance, some of them are to reduce. We just want to make sure the council knows why we think they're so important and why we oftentimes fight so hard for these types of programs. And the second thing is the council retreat's coming up, right? So again, rather than spend all this time on the retreat, we thought it'd be helpful to kind of share what is such a critical part to the Hillsboro base with the council now leading up into that retreat.
Director Diaz, for this list, I really appreciate this work session, but for the downtown urban renewal area, how many of these businesses are located in that renewal area?
That's a great question. And again, you've nailed like the segue questions, like 5 for 5. So awesome. This is the map of where the enterprise zones are currently. And as Councilor Harris noted, they are defined in part by, we have to be in eligible census tracts and they have to be areas that are designated for industrial. And keep in mind, the enterprise zone, again, is focused on, you could also think of it as limited to, traded sector companies. So you have to be demonstrating that you are making goods or services that are being exported, for lack of a better term, out of the area. And so that, depending on the different industry mixes we have, can affect what the concentration is. But there are the large majority of the enterprise zone companies' investments are in North Hillsboro. You'll see the color, the teal color is the enterprise zone that's in and around our downtown. And we do have some companies that have looked and in the past have been eligible down in there. But it's important to note that those community service fees we're collecting don't have to stay tied to the geography. If they're collected in North Hillsboro, they don't have to stay in North Hillsboro. We can take them and put them into workforce efforts that are supporting the full enterprise zone. Back to why we've done Coast and Amos and Focus Central Pros for that here in our downtown, even though it was not only funded by the enterprise zone companies in downtown. So I hope that answers your question. We can bring back a map that shows the locations in a future presentation to give a concentration benefit, but the large majority of them, both in terms of number and also scale and size of investments, are happening up in the darker blue area. And then just for the sake of closing out, this is the last slide on enterprise zones, the green area was a gap in our zone. It was an eligible part of the census tract, but we had not applied it a few years ago when we renewed the enterprise zone boundary. At the time, there was the Jackson East conversation going on up there. And frankly, the city wasn't even quite clear at that time what it was going to even be zoned or whether it was going to be urbanized. That has worked its way through the planning efforts. And we did come back through and ultimately applied the enterprise zone incentive program into that eligible area now. So that was made effective at the end of 2024. So everything you see here that's blue, green, and then teal is all part of basically the Hillsboro Enterprise Zone. So that really wraps up the Enterprise Zone program. Hopefully that's helpful. And then we'll switch into the last of the tools, which is tax increment, also known as urban renewal. I'll try to move again pretty swiftly through this because we will be able to come back in the economic development work session and talk a bit more about the plans and the why a little bit we're doing it here. But we did want to frame up the what, especially this evening, for some of those same comparative pieces that Councilor Harris just noted in terms of like, this is important to our local budget situations, because if we don't have SIP projects or SIP eligible projects, we won't have gain share. We need to be mindful of that as we plan for it. If we don't have enterprise zone, we won't have community service fees coming in, and all of it may affect the degree of new capital intensive growth we have being made, whether it be in existing facilities or new facilities also coming into Hillsboro. I'll stop short this evening of making the linkage to land use as Robbie was doing earlier, but that will come in also later work sessions as well. So tax increment financing is also known as urban renewal. And I'll try to explain it the best I can, but I find that this graphic is really pretty helpful. So many different states use urban renewal. It's created in a bit of a unique way in Oregon in that you have these components. So a couple of key terms are on the right side. The frozen base. Where's your lightsaber? Come around that for a second. Thank you. This area here is what we refer to as the frozen base. So at any moment in time, take downtown or North Hillsboro, but we'll use downtown for tonight's example. When we started the urban renewal zone roughly in 2014, there was an existing tax base that was in line with Measure 5 and 50, and that was creating some tax revenue at that point in time. When you create an urban renewal district, there's many things you have to do, but one of the elements of it is it freezes that tax base. So that tax base level, and that's why you see this straight line over the period of time. So on the x-axis is time duration, on the y-axis is the property tax revenue being generated off of that geographic area, because it has to be a defined geographic area. So the frozen property tax base continues to generate taxes that go to the county assessor and get disseminated across all the taxing districts as they normally would. So no taxing district is out any money. It's just they may not see additional money for that period of time of the tax increment district being eligible. So that's what you see down here through the life. This red line is when we sunset the urban renewal or the tax increment district. And this is the line where Suzanne's pushing on this side, trying to get it this way, and I'm pushing on this side, trying to kind of balance it this way, but more to that to come later. So any questions on the frozen tax base? Doesn't really do anything to help fund the district. It doesn't do harm to the existing tax districts. It basically freezes it for a period of time. The blue area really becomes the heart and the important part of tax increment financing. So from the date that the district starts and that base is frozen, hopefully you're seeing degrees of activity and new investment coming in and assessed value growth. And that growth over that period of time is then captured and then directed back into the goals of that plan, which can be infrastructure projects. And we'll give a couple examples of this in a minute, or specific public-private partnerships or facilities or things like that. And so what it's seeking to do is really harness public financing opportunity, focus it in a certain area to achieve certain community priorities. And there is a fiscal benefit, is hopefully you come out the tail end of it and have also really accelerated what is the tax base that was been present there as well. So that's what we call tax increment, and that's in the blue area. And that grows at different paces, right? That really is determined on what is the level of private investment and assessed value growth in the district. Relatively new in Oregon is this new cap. And so this is a bit of a piece that's unique to Oregon urban renewal that was implemented, is now the maximum indebtedness. And so this maximum indebtedness, or I'm sorry, this is the cap for revenue sharing. Let me step back one. Maximum indebtedness is the most amount of money that the district can take out in debt. So really the way most of the time tax increment works is you can go and say, okay, we project or have demonstrated a certain degree of growth. You can operate on a cash flow basis like a business. As we collect $1,000 in of tax increment, we can go spend $1,000 out. Or in many instances, you can go out and say, we're going to take on debt to front load more capital for certain projects now. And then as that is inducing tax increment growth, we pay back the debt. It's a timing of how much money do you need and when, and what can you afford. But we have to establish a number. There's a formulaic methodology that's behind it. What is the maximum indebtedness that the district can take out? Because we can't borrow or expend more than that on the areas to keep this from really these things being in place forever, constantly consuming this tax revenue and never really getting back off, bringing everything back onto the full tax rolls and getting rid of the tax district. So that's what you'll hear with maximum indebtedness. In Oregon, what this line is showing and why you see a dark blue piece come up is there is also a thing called revenue sharing. So what happens is if your district is successful enough, you generate and grow your tax base, this tax increment, you'll hit a threshold where now, even though the district is still alive, we're not on this side of the red line yet, you have to start to share some of that new tax growth back to those taxing districts. Really, it's to try to make them a little bit more whole in their direct financial realization happening a little bit sooner versus them seeing it all when we get to the green portion here. Do you want to add something on that?
I just think that speaks again to that win-win we were talking about earlier. So folks that are in overlapping taxing jurisdictions, once we get to that revenue sharing, they're actually seeing some of the fruits of the labor of what's been going on in the district for however many years until it hit that threshold. And there's two thresholds. There's a 10% threshold, and that's when maximum indebtedness, when your increment is 10% of your, I know I'm getting you guys into numbers. I'll just say this, there's a 10% threshold and we've already gotten there.
When the amount you're collecting annually is more than 10% of the maximum indebtedness number you set out for the district.
Right, which is currently around 17 million for our North Hillsboro district. And we did hit revenue sharing this year. So next year we will be sharing 75% of the increment will go back to the overlapping taxing jurisdictions. Again,
above and beyond that, we will still get the full share of the blue, but whatever's above and beyond that threshold is now where we start to share that percentage back.
Correct. And then there's the cap. We will hit the cap when we hit 12.5% of maximum indebtedness in terms of what our increment is coming in. And we think we'll hit the cap here probably in the next couple of years. And then that will be capped through the remainder of the life of the agency. However, what's great about it is then the overlapping taxing jurisdictions see some of that benefit before we close out the TIF district.
So we'll move on here, but really the definitions of success of this incentive program, back to some of the win-wins, is we're able to come up with public funding focused into some of these key areas of focus for the city, we're seeking to try to achieve local community policies. That can be placemaking, that can be driving certain industries, it can be enhancing, infrastructure. And then we also are successful if we've achieved a greater than what would have otherwise occurred without that intervention or investment, assessed value growth. And so we get a financial benefit, we hopefully get a placemaking and a community benefit out of it. And in some cases, we may get an industry benefit out of it. So that's TIF as best as I can do in a short period of time, as I know we're starting to run a little long 101. Are there any questions on that structure before we move on? And again, we can come back to this too, either in follow-up offline conversations or even when we come back with the next ECDF presentation. So in Hillsboro, and one thing I actually failed to mention at the E-zone piece, and I'll mention here, is we have to, much like in SIP, we have to negotiate with the county and with the business piece. Whenever we're creating an enterprise zone district or expanding it, or when we're creating a tax increment district, we have to go out and do engagement. And in many cases, the county, in some cases, the school district report will have to sign off and approve those. And so we don't get to do this unilaterally. We work with them to let them know, look, here's our plans for this area. Here could be the financial impacts to you, but here's those benefit pieces. And we've had a successful and historic track record of really working with those taxing districts to understand what our community's vision and goals are, and to also be able to demonstrate mutual gain even back to those other taxing entities with our work here. So I'm pushing the next button. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Take that thing away from me before I put some eye out. So Hillsboro's tax increment district history is really threefold. We've had 3 of these in the city's history. The first was Ronler Acres. I saw the 2001 with the question mark because we got to confirm that date. Is it 2001? All right. So that district was created, actually, give me, say it back one more time, in and around the Ronler Acre Arenco Station area, which falls about here. And if you think about it, that was done at a point in time in the late 1980s, early 1990s, following on our city's leadership and community saying, we want to create our own economic base here in Hillsboro to support our long-term growth, continue to support us as a full-service city that we've committed to. It happens at a time when there was alignment with the state where we're creating things like the SIP program to say, bring in major tech investments and capital investments here to build up an Oregon economy. And it happened at a point in time where the city, again, was largely existing here, really hadn't started too much, a little bit up the Jackson School Road corridor and a little bit out TV Highway. But we've got another presentation that really animates this, how this is going over time, but it really is focused on this area. It went into an area that was at the time planned for about an 808 unit residential subdivision in the county that had failed because they couldn't put infrastructure in there. And that was the entire area. And we came in and said, look, we have interest in expanding and planning into this area. Some of it we want to be industrial, some of it we want to be residential. And it was this tool largely that delivered the bullet points you see up there. We used urban renewal to go buy up almost all of that defunct subdivision, which ultimately then was sold and transacted to Intel, which has now become Intel Ronler Acres. The other parts of it that we didn't buy up all with the urban renewal district, PAC Trust came in and master planned out the award-winning Arenco station and put that immediately paired here too. But with the tax increment district, not only were we doing land acquisitions, we invested in critical infrastructure. So Evergreen Road at the time largely didn't exist, was put in with this. Parts of Chute Road, parts of Cornell Road extension, Butler Road, Cornelius Pass Road improvements all came as a byproduct of this from a transportation infrastructure standpoint. In addition to that, there was community plans and benefits for this area. So Hondo Dog Park and the entire Gordon Faber Sports Complex, which ultimately downstream led to the Hop Stadium, great vision, but it enabled these other pieces. Those facilities were acquired not with general fund revenue, not with parks revenue. They were purchased with tax increment revenue that had been captured for this area, largely as Intel started to make investment. And we saw rapid tax increment escalation. We were able to go out and achieve those other pieces. And then ultimately, we knew we needed a fire station, not only to support the industrial growth in this area, but also to support easterly bound Hillsboro growth, which led to fire station number 3 right there at Century and Evergreen Road. And so that was a closeout. It was, as you can see up there, confirmed, 12 years. That's relatively short. You see big cities to the east of us with tax increment districts for decades. When you look at the financial numbers, and we won't get into all this tonight, but financially, it was one of the most successful when you look at the amount of tax revenue generated and that assessed base growth, largely because we paired it with a SIP agreement and an intel on their acres. But most importantly, it really creates a lot of the identifying features that for the last 3 decades, our community has touted itself. It's on our websites. It's in our videos of what makes Hillsboro great. It's called out as to why we constantly are recognized nationally for one of the most, award-winning livable places to be, was driven by a lot of the use and the alignment of these different tools. Similarly, in downtown, we created the tax increment district in 2010. That is still active, and that was focused not so much on taking blighted, undeveloped areas and seeking to drive like significant, like big industry scale investments like we saw in Ronler, but really to try to continue to vitalize and invest in many of the sub neighborhoods of downtown between the government kind of Main Street core area proximate to us here, the southwest and what we call the southwest industrial area that is going to the west into Dairy Creek, the Oak Baseline corridor in the health and education district, and then eastwardly towards Caydias and the 10th Avenue neighborhood on the eastern end. And so that plan, when you look at it, has a lot around trying to improve streetscapes, trying to support, residential development to support incomes and households and living downtown, but also trying to support many of the small businesses that we find seeking to thrive and be here. It also has led to our ability to invest in key projects like the 4th and Main project, Block 67, which we recently executed the development agreement on and are progressing with a pretty catalytic development opportunity there. We have funded operational programs like our storefront and tenant improvement grant programs. Everything from Gimri's Food to Ochoa's Restaurant have benefited from that program. And then we've also supported things like the Main Street Commons housing projects. Pair that now, as we continue to look to use these tools for complete community planning, we shifted off of some of the successes and lessons learned in the Ronler to then looking at the North Hillsboro Technology Park. And that's the area highlighted in yellow on this map in the upper portion. So the downtown urban renewal district highlighted down here, the other active one in North Hillsboro up here. It basically runs from just east of Brookwood, west all the way to Sewell Avenue, and is what we also refer to as the Hillsboro Technology Park in many efforts. That has become an important piece. It was established in 2015. The goal of that district was really to try to increase the development readiness of the last of the industrial lands we have in on the north side and to try to stay ahead of some of those key target industries getting ready to potentially make investments here, biotech, semi-tech, and the like. Eligible projects that we funded to date and that are called out in that plan but are noteworthy is Huffman Road. We work to extend Huffman Road and utilities in to open up multiple sites in that area. The Crescent Park Greenway, we've used TIF funding to acquire sites. So we have Crescent Park Greenway segment now from Gordon Faber Sports Complex, just about actually as of about 2 weeks ago, all the way to Jackson School Road. Now that's a significant chunk of that major trail corridor delivered largely with this program. We also were able to work with partners like Clean Water Services. So that area originally had 3 sewer pump stations planned. And we said, why would we build 3? And the reason was because it was going to anticipate incremental growth building out to the west. And we said, what if we built 1 pump station at the very bottom part of the basin and we were able to ultimately design and deliver that? That saved basically about $24 million worth of pump stations. And we didn't need those other 2 so we can be efficient. And in doing that, we actually opened up the full area with sewer access now rather than just 1 or 2 sites benefiting at a time. So a lot of different pieces there, and that has in turn led to companies like Hitachi High Tech putting their global nanotechnology campus, research campus up there. JSR Micros come in, XPO, which is a major logistics provider for much of our industry up there, is in there. We've seen some data centers go in. We've seen other critical infrastructure like substations go in, and we still have a few sites that are being considered. So those are the different districts. We'll come back with more details on the plans there.
Dan, really quick.
Yeah.
I think you just accidentally jumped over the land aggregation. I just want to give credit to you and Val and so many and the council last year, the last couple of years. A lot of effort was put into trying to aggregate larger parcels. Again, going back to our industrial development, it's really hard to find large industrial parcels in all of Oregon, let alone the metro region. So we were able to use a lot of that funding to purchase, I don't know, what are we up to, 300 or 400 acres?
About 340? I'm looking at Val. She just keeps me accurate on the exact numbers.
Yeah.
Are you counting me or just Jackson?
Me and Jackson East.
Jackson East was 94 acres, and then
140,
Lincoln's about
yeah.
260.
So we're getting close to 400
Yeah,
acres,
yeah.
right? And that was done with funding here through this program. And so now we have a lot of land up there that we can control as a city. Technically, you all as the
Hillsboro Economic Development Council.
like ATDC, some of the acronyms.
Yeah.
It's just important. And Dan and Val last year did this and their staff did this on their own. They saved us millions of dollars by doing this work in-house, so we didn't have to pay all these other, real estate fees and everything. So it was just a Herculean effort, and the council was amazing in supporting this effort over the past couple of years.
And a big part of that was trying to position our city, because at the same time we were actively engaged in conversations with the governor's office and other players about the possibility for Senate Bill 4 lands up in that area. If those would have come in, great. This is a lot of the infrastructure corridor. We've now invested in stubbed the industrial scale infrastructure right to that area. And this could have been a contributing piece of that. It was actually put forward as part of the National Semiconductor Technology Center site as well, and ended up being the leading candidate for the state's consideration there. But it also becomes important in the event we are unable to get additional industrial lands in the north, because that really is the last of our industrial base. And if we're making millions of dollars in infrastructure and site readiness, we now have the ability to then determine a bit what are the users and the industries that go in there, and that some will say you're not letting the market do its thing fully, but for us, it's a bit of prioritization to ensure making the most of what we have, because it is important to our financial tax base, our economic mix, and the like. So thanks, Robbie, for flagging that. That is a big effort, and one that maybe the therapy is finally kicking in terms of. Sorry, that was for Val. All right, keep us moving.
Sorry, I have a question. So it says till present. So do they have a end date? Because I also remember you saying that Suzanne would like to push it to the right. And
yeah, there's not a defined end date in statute in many of these plans, but so that's not required. We always try to be as proactive and focused as we can to get in, achieve the goals of the plan, which is hopefully bringing that community benefit piece back, seek to maximize the assessed value growth, and then close it out as quickly as possible. So that's why they're present, because they're still very active with investments going on in both North Hillsboro and downtown. Great question, though. All right, so just a quick overview. Again, we'll talk more about the full plans, but this is the numbers here become important to what Suzanne's going to wrap us up on here in a few slides. Overall is this shows the North Hillsboro Industrial Renewal Area. The goals that are probably too briefly summarized in the upper right were to maximize the sustainable economic impact of urbanization of that area. We do try to be very cognizant of when we're bringing in rural areas into our urban growth boundary, being as efficient and maximizing the benefit and the effect and the goals of what those areas are to be urbanized for. The other objective was to achieve land use and economic development objectives, as Robbie mentioned, and as we've talked about some of our traded sector industries and investment. We talked about the implementation of the MEEC and Jackson East comprehensive plan areas. There are some unique land use parameters up there as well, large lot requirements and things like that. So this is a way to ensure they hit some of the policy intentions in the land use space, and then really to support the delivery of infrastructure. And so you can see a breakout. This is an example of what you will see in an urban renewal plan. These are the different types of projects that we've identified in the plan that largely come from our land use plans that we have put cost to and are become eligible expenditures. That's different than the maximum indebtedness, but they have to be in the plan in order for us to utilize tax increment funding on them. And so roughly it rolls up to about 40% of the 370 million, which is the maximum indebtedness up there, go to transportation related projects, about 40% to other public utility projects. You can see trails, and I won't read through all of them this evening. But again, real time happening. In the upper left is, I believe that's JSR Micro off of Star Boulevard. And in the lower right is the unassuming pump station, but that's the pump station that saved us from having to deliver two others and is located right off of Sewell Avenue up there. And then just you'll see in plans too, we are limited in terms of the maximum capacity in the city limits that we can use. There are thresholds in the state enabling legislation around the total acreage and the total amount of assessed value citywide, about 20% of each. And so we have to be very cognizant. That's why we can't have the entire city in a tax increment district. We have to be selective and intentional of where we deploy these, how much we're looking to kind of cap in them, both from an area standpoint and assessed value standpoint. But here's a quick summary for North Hillsboro. You can see it's at roughly 1,200, almost 1,300 gross acres in total size. The total project costs we identified that could be funded are about $370 million. We have forecasted, Councilor Anvery, to your question, about a 25-year life, even though, much like Ronler, we're looking at this one thinking it might end up being a bit shorter than that given the progress. And then we're looking at the TIF revenue being about 332 million. And then you'll see that maximum indebtedness number, that number we cannot exceed down at the bottom for that district, is about 268 million. The map on the right just shows where we expanded it. So much like the enterprise zone, it started in the green area. And then as the Jackson East piece came in, it was a critical piece. It was immediately adjacent. And so that area was ultimately amended by the Hillsboro Economic Development Council to be part of that district. Any questions on that one before we keep moving?
Of course, I've got one. So the revenue is just from the TIF revenue. You still have the base amount coming in.
The frozen base is still coming in across all the taxing districts. This is the tax increment revenue.
Right, and then the maximum indebtedness, there's a gap between project costs and maximum indebtedness. Is that the city put that up, or do you use, is it a rolling number so you don't have to put up additional monies?
Yeah, especially in this district, we put more projects in than we knew we could take debt out for. And there was a couple, I'll hit the reasons quickly on this. Maybe we could take part of that offline in more depth if it's desired. Some of that was you have to have it in as a project cost in order to be eligible to expend money on. So we've said, let's put all the projects we can really think of in here so they're all eligible, even though at least from a debt standpoint, we couldn't fund all of them. The second reason is the maximum indebtedness is the amount of debt you can take out. Sometimes there'll be operational capital. So for example, the Hitachi site, we bought that land, we put in the Huffman Quarter infrastructure, and there was a surplus footprint of land that we sold back ultimately to the developer in Hitachi to deliver that site. And so there was debt, but then there's operating capital. So we can sometimes spend more than just the maximum indebtedness. And then thirdly, just to underpin public-private partnerships, a lot of that infrastructure that's in that project cost, we seek to negotiate and have private projects come in and deliver that infrastructure, oftentimes at a more cost-effective basis. Sometimes we'll use other credits, but there's a reason. That's the other reason why we shot bigger, knowing that we were going to seek to try to work some other projects to take on some of that infrastructure cost burden as well.
I assume you get SDCs and things like
Correct,
that.
and that's the whole other financing side. But yeah, that's how we work these deals, trying to be intentional and maximize those different benefits like you talked about.
Hopefully it won't come out of our general revenue.
Correct. Yeah, and it hasn't, except for very few capital projects, and then we're backfilling with the tax increment dollars usually. So this is a quick video I would like to show. I know we're getting a little long in time, but this, I hope, really captures both the community build-out benefit, but what we can do when we are intentional aligned in our land use planning, in our infrastructure funding, in our incentives deployment, and then trying to maximize those very goals we started out with. So this shows the North Hillsboro Technology Park with drone footage that we fly every couple of years that really shows key corridors where they go from colors on a map that you ultimately approve as city council, ultimately to being funded and approved, and then are creating tax base and jobs in the economy we've talked about. And Mark's going to remind me that I didn't share Polly with sound. So this is just instrumental music. I'll narrate it briefly. So that is Genentech. You'll see there. And when it flips sides, there are years. So this is stacked infrastructure right off of Star Boulevard. That is Star Boulevard, north to south, Evergreens in the background. This is Huffman. From Brookwood West, you'll see Amazon and QTS. And we're going to keep going down Huffman. So there's Amazon and then QTS. And then here's Huffman in 2020. And then when we flip over to Huffman in 2023, and this investment was all made with tax increment dollars. And then you can see the adjacent development. They're finishing out the sidewalks, the street lights, the other pieces. And by us not building a full road cross section, we were able to get further deeper in the site. Hitachi was to the left. Now we're just going to fly back. So again, that infrastructure is put in a public-private partnership fashion. We're achieving a major target industry investment, and that's a significant hundreds of millions of dollars capital investment also coming into the tax increment district to continue to drive tax increment growth near term, broader citywide AV growth long term. We were able to preserve that stand of trees. We ultimately sold the XPO there, and you'll see on the far right side, 30th Avenue starting to run north-south, and we stubbed that out there as well. But those aren't just roads. Underneath there, we're putting the sewer, the water, the fiber infrastructure in as well. So now we'll come up to the north. This is XPO, now 30th Avenue. So we just flew in from the right. That gravel pad is now PGE's Evergreen substation that's built out. Time for another drone flight, I suppose. That home plate looking thing is the pump station we talked about in the middle of nowhere, but optimally located to serve that entire North Hillsboro area. And so now we'll come back and you can see again the Chute substation. This is Flex Central. So now we're going back up north, up Star Boulevard to the Meek sub area. And we'll probably hit parts of this on a future tour. But you can see JSR Micro. They helped us extend sewer, even though we had delivered the road and the water infrastructure up to their site at the time. And then there's parts of the Crescent Park Greenway corridor. And then we will wrap up by flying through this direction. Sorry, I didn't optimize this for video or for the audio. But you can see this is going back down Star Boulevard. So QTS, billion-dollar project on the left side. Flex Central Data Center on the right side, doing targeted research and development for some of our key industries. And we're going south towards Evergreen and Hillsboro Airport. These are just some of the projects. And then we will end with, in the background here is now the Meek site. So that is a part of that 140 acres in Meek that we acquired, in the broader 200 plus acres that the Economic Development Council is now owning and aggregating, that we would be putting in front of future business projects for investment as well. But the infrastructure that we've flew and invested in is now also fully serving that site in its entirety. So we'll keep moving there. Can I go to the next slide?
So why wouldn't why hasn't like QTS, et cetera, come for a SIP agreement? Why were they not interested?
The main reasons there are the enterprise zone largely is meeting, the enterprise zone is largely meeting their investment threshold limits and is a by right program. So in many cases, like a QTS would be in an enterprise zone situation, not a SIP program. Although the investment numbers, when you look at just the investment amounts, you could make a case could be in a SIP territory.
Okay.
But there's a variety of reasons why sometimes, again, companies might say enterprise zone is sufficient for what our business needs are to make the investment here, or we don't maybe want to go through the full negotiation of a SIP. There's a lot of different reasons for that. Yeah. So I'll turn over to Sue just to talk about the financial numbers on North Hillsboro, and then we'll do an overview of downtown, and we'll move on to the final closing
You
remarks.
can always tell when it's my chart versus Dan's chart, or somebody who's fancier with PowerPoint than I am. I like numbers, so you'll have to bear with me. And I really like these numbers. So we started out with a frozen base. Can I go to that guy?
Yeah.
And this is North Hillsboro, of 380 million in assessed value. That's what's frozen. That's that lower part of the graph that Dan showed at the beginning of the section. And that's what overlapping taxing jurisdictions, including Hillsboro, are still seeing and continue to see the benefit through the life of this tax district. It was amended, so there was a slight amendment here. And that had to do with the assessor. I think there was an issue with how it originally came on. And it kicked off in 2016. We were receiving about $488,000 in tax increment in 16-17 when we first had our first year of increment. And you can see how that has grown. This year, 24-25, and this is the levy at 96% of the levy, because we allow for some that's uncollected, is $17.4 million. So we've seen a 3,470% growth rate in increment, and almost a 400% growth rate in assessed value over, what is this, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. As Dan talked about earlier, that Ronler Acres was 11 to 12 years. Ronler Acres did not take out as much debt as we have already taken out under this district. And you can't really close out the district until you've dealt with all the debt and paid off the debt. So we had the largest financing we did was last year. And that's what Robbie was referring to for that. I think that was our third time out buying parcels of property So we're sitting on approximately $120 million in debt in our renewal district. But the way that we are not having any problem servicing that debt with the way that we're seeing these increases occur. We aren't actively looking at new debt, but it's at some point we may be able to, our margins might be enough that we would be looking at potentially some additional debt that would allow us to accomplish the tasks and projects faster. But again, we're not immediately looking at that. This is what I would, if anyone was looking at this that is familiar with urban renewal districts, would have to say that this is very successful. And if you drove down Evergreen or Huffman 5 years ago and then drove down it recently, you can just see from the video and the changes that that's what this is. That's what you're seeing here on this slide.
And Suzanne, I think given some of the questions around like were entities up there using enterprise zone or not, this doesn't account for those projects that have been built within the last 5 years that also are using enterprise zone and abating the property taxes, because that would not show up here. So these numbers actually are probably a bit conservatively low still, not fully reflecting the full scale of investments that have not yet hit yet because they're in enterprise zone abatement at the moment.
Right. So thank you for mentioning that. That's a really important piece.
Some of us work hard at that part too, just to try to, again, trying to achieve multiple definitions of success here.
Right. So Dan had referred to how many companies we have in E-zone currently, and I think it was in the 40s. Many of those companies are actively up here in North Hillsboro. So we're not seeing that as part of the tax base yet. They will ultimately come on the tax base, into the tax base and on the tax roll in the district. Like Dan was saying, potentially at a lower rate because some of their have larger equipment will have depreciated fairly rapidly, but still some value will be coming back on the roll, and that is not reflected here. So this is actually conservative. And just a reminder again that, and it was this year that we triggered the revenue sharing. So next year we will be sharing some of this increment with our overlapping taxing jurisdictions, which is a good story to tell.
And with us too. Right?
And with us too.
Our general fund.
Yeah.
So I think I missed it, but how much has been spent? How much has the public spent so far on the infrastructure then? Was it 120?
Total about 124 million, I believe, but not all of that has been in the form of debt. Some of that's come back with operational capital. We can follow up with an exact number on that one.
Okay, I'm just curious. But you're collecting 17 million a year, so I mean, it's going to be made up relatively quickly, it appears to me. All right.
That 0.96 levy, what?
So
What is-
24, 25 is not, this year is not completed yet. So
Okay.
we get a levied amount, what was levied and what is it's supposed to be paid. And it's actually in the 18 million range. But we assume that there'll be a certain amount of uncollectible. And I think 0.4% or sorry, 4% is probably pretty high, but that's what we use in the general fund. So that's what we used here.
Okay.
All the other numbers that you're seeing in there are actuals.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we will move just to wrap up the urban renewal piece. And again, this is a quick initial highlight of downtown because that is a critical urban renewal district for us as well. And then we will move on to the closing remarks for tonight. But again, on the urban renewal district pieces, much like the other two incentive pieces, if you have questions or interest around what's in those plans, please feel free to reach out to Rob or us because we will be getting into a bit more depth on that in a future economic development broader overview. So the downtown area policy goals, similar to what we highlighted in North Hillsboro, but quite different because they're tailored to this portion of our community, are to increase the vibrancy of the business and the community activities in downtown. I mentioned that in some of the comments earlier on previous slides. It is to really support the additional housing capacity development in downtown. We have seen a pretty significantly constrained market for new housing in the greater downtown area for quite a few decades, and there's pros and cons with that. We can talk about at a later date. But this does allow funding for us to engage in public-private partnerships on regulated affordable housing, on market rate housing, on workforce housing, some of which we anticipate seeing materialize in the Block 67 development, for example. We also seek to support the implementation of other city policies like the Downtown Framework Plan, and that laid out a variety of different infrastructure-related pieces and some placemaking components. And then lastly is to support delivery for paying for infrastructure. So there's a lot of things in downtown between sidewalk enhancements. We recently engaged in a Oak Baseline Corridor study that still has some items to clear with ODOT, but these are the type of infrastructure programs too that can help us fund things. It's help to fund improvements in the Cayugas 10th Avenue corridor with some sidewalk and some lighting repairs and the like as well. So a variety of different projects here, but different in nature from the approach we're taking and how we're expending on projects in North Hillsboro, largely because it's a far more built out and mature environment versus a greenfield environment. Pictures on the right really highlight a variety of that. So between our downtown banners that are supported, work we've done in the health and education district and like the intermodal transit facility there, the Venetian storefront tenant improvement grant is an example, augmentation at the library and the like. So this shows in a different graphical format, I'll kick it over to you here, but in a non-tabular format, the tax increment growth in the downtown area since its inception. Do you want to talk through this like you did the other one? I don't want to steal your thunder
we
or
don't
talk
have,
about
we don't
numbers.
have assessed value on the slide. We just have the increment growth over time. I mean, as Dan pointed out, this is just a very different urban renewal district than the North Hillsboro urban renewal district, much smaller scale, but still very, very important. It has been very successful as well in terms of increment growth. The growth since inception, which was 2011-12, it's grown 2,160% in increment growth. So we just wanted to give you an idea too of how this tax increment fund is working. This fund does not have any debt associated with it currently. We have potentially assumed in various forecasts that we might ultimately issue some debt, but we have not at this point in time. And that's it for that slide. And I think I'm next. So we do have another section to go before we get to the key takeaways. I will try to go through this as quickly as I can, but the idea of this section is really to try to embody what this all means for Hillsboro. And there's so many different ways that we could share this information. I backed into it in a few different ways, and I'll speak to those today. So this is looking at what we've collected in SIP. So all three SIPs, four SIPs, including Genentech and Gainshare over the last 25 years. We have collected as a city, so not the county's portion, just the city's portion, $337 million. And right there, that number. And then I thought, well, what if we didn't have that source of revenue? What would that have meant in terms of, say, we needed to go out to the voters and we wanted to have the same amenities that we currently have? What would that have meant in the way of a general obligation bond? So I just divided that by 25 years and then determined that would be a GEO bond ask of another 71 cents on top of our permanent rate and our local option rate. And looked at the average household single family residence, which is currently assessed value. This is not real market value. This is assessed value. Would be a cost to a single family residence of $235 in additional property taxes if we converted this to a GEO bond. Then over here, I said, well, okay, well, if we didn't have all this, we probably wouldn't have Intel's assessed value in our tax base. So then I took that out. This is the tax base right here. Our tax base is 18.8 billion, or a number I've referred to earlier. If I took Intel out of what's sitting in our tax base, and it would be 16.7, the tax rate would be slightly higher at 80 cents. Or $264 per residential household, just to give you an idea of what that estimated tax would be. Next slide, please. So then I look through the tax rolls for Washington County, and just to give us an idea, we're kind of out there not having any GEO bonds. So these are all of the other jurisdictions in Washington County that are currently in 2024-25 have active general obligation bonds, meaning they packaged a certain number of capital projects. They went to the voters said yes, and now they're taxing those. They're taxing their community members to get these funds to probably pay debt service, because they've likely gone out and issued debt. So I was just trying to kind of look at, okay, well, this is how much taxes they're raising annually. And then this is where we would have been if we had to go out to the market and ask for a GEO bond. This is just to give you an idea of what that would look like. this is probably the most important takeaway from this. What we've been able to do, and this is what Robbie was referring to earlier, in our ability to leverage these dollars, because we have tried our best not to get reliant on this in terms of our operational funds for public safety and for our community services like libraries and parks and recreation. We've tried to put this in bricks and mortar, and for the most part, we've been successful. The last few years have been harder, and we'll have that discussion when we come back in February. But these are all the projects, and we've listed them by type. So since for the last 25 years, we've built 2 fire stations. We've remodeled a training facility. We're building the South Hillsboro Fire Station. We will be building police headquarters. We bought land for the Brookwood Fire Station. We put in some money prior to the North Hillsboro Urban Renewal District. We actually put some money in to buy some land up there a long time ago. We also have been investing in Highlight with Gain Share, affordable housing. We put money into our pavement management program. We're not currently doing that, but we did do that for many years. Hidden Creek Community Center was built entirely on the backs of SIP. That's where the debt service is being funded for. The Hillsboro Ballpark. Expansion of the Brookwood Library. So you can look through the list. These are all the things that we've been able to do as a result of leveraging those SIP dollars and Gain Share dollars over the last 25 years. And I'm guessing I probably missed some projects on here as well. Thank you. So now we're going to take another look at this, a little different look. So this is comparing to 2 cities of similar size. So this is the tax assessed values. So it doesn't include SIP. It doesn't include E-zone. And it's showing how we compare to Beaverton and Gresham. So the far left is total assessed value, and we're in the dark blue. And the middle is the city's assessed value, and then the far right is the urban renewal, because each of them also have an urban renewal district. But if you add those 2 together, you get the far left. The more telling is the next slide. When you're looking at the tax base and the makeup of the tax base. You look at residential, we're pretty similar to Beaverton, like right spot on, which I thought was quite interesting in terms of how much of our total tax base is in residential. Gresham is a little bit lower. But you start to look at commercial and personal property and machinery and equipment and industrial and utility is where you really see that our investment in economic development really showing up in our tax base. Commercial, that includes data centers and many other things, but data center is one component of that. Personal property, all the equipment within those data centers is sitting in that personal property. Our apartments are pretty the same as, I wouldn't say there's a big difference, but amongst the cities. Machinery and equipment, that's going to be the large scale industrial equipment that the likes of an Intel would have that are in our on the tax rolls. Industrial, that's going to be the land and buildings and property. Utility, we have a large presence of substations in the city of Hillsboro to support the industry that is out there. So they also pay property taxes, and so you see a very significant value in that utility section as well. I know, but this actually does work. For God's sake. Oh.
You're doing great. Keep going. Sorry. It's getting late.
Wait, it works, I swear. Okay. So this is me, more numbers. I apologize, and we're getting a little punchy here. Again, we're still comparing 3 cities together, and I'm trying to show why they're different and kind of to tell a story that I think is compelling. So if you look at the city of Hillsboro, we are a full service city. Our tax rate is $5.38 when you include our local option levy. That raises, including urban renewal. This was the number. The 20 million was the number. 116 million a year in the last tax year, 24-25. We added to compare to the other cities, the 22 cents from the county library, which raises around 3.7 million in the city of Hillsboro, for a total of 119 million levied related to providing services within the city of Hillsboro. You go to the city of Beaverton, they're not a full service city. They don't have fire and parks, so you actually need to add fire and parks in. So that's why I'm adding TVF&R and THPRD in here. Their total tax rate is $9.20 when you add all of these in. to compare apples to apples, they're collecting about 123 million, so very similar to the Hillsboro, but at a tax rate that is much higher. Gresham does not have library, so we added in the Multnomah County Library down here. Their tax rate is $6.18. They recently, just within the last, I think, year or so, passed this local option levy. I think it failed at least once. And so this is new revenue for them. They do have an urban renewal district, so they're collecting about $73 million to serve their community with similar type services as compared to Beaverton and to Hillsboro. And their tax rate is just slightly above ours. The reason why there's this disparity here is because of the differences in our assessed value. So we're starting with a much higher assessed value. So our rate goes a lot further than a Beaverton or a Gresham. I also think it's important to note, yeah, our population's pretty similar, especially Hillsboro to Gresham. The average assessed value in Hillsboro and Washington County for residential household is 328. In Gresham, it's 244,000. So they get a double whammy. Not only are their tax rates lower because their average assessed value in residential is so low, the rate is going into a lower number, therefore providing less in taxes. So I know this is a lot of numbers. I apologize for that. I do like numbers. Real market value in Hillsboro is almost 61 million. Billion. 26 billion in Beaverton, and 23 billion in Gresham. I think it's also important to note the city as a percent of the total Washington County assessed value is 22%. So if you're looking at the total county, the assessed value in the total county is 86 billion. We make up almost 22% of that. From an RMV perspective, real market value, we make up 31% of the real market value of Washington County.
Sorry, I just wanted to keep.
Okay, thank you. Just want to see me. So I don't know if there were any questions on that. I know I went through that quickly. I know we're all getting tired here. So this is yet another way of kind of looking at it and hoping that I'm sharing some information that is making sense to you all. So in 2024-25, the abated value for Intel's 2005 SIP was $4 billion. Intel's 2014 SIP value abated was $16.2 billion. Genentech, 135 million, and then all the E-zones combined together going on in 24-25 totaled about 3.4 billion. That totals to almost $24 billion. Well, this is our assessed value, city's assessed value. That's the total of just these is 126% of our total city assessed value. And this, if you assume that you would take our tax rate and apply that to these, we would have collected, well, we wouldn't have collected because they wouldn't have built here, but we would have doubled the size of our levy. $128 million would have been what would have been assessed just in the city alone, compared to that number I showed on a previous slide, which was 119 million.
Will that next year when they come off the rolls?
This value is going to depreciate rather quickly, and this one doesn't come off the rolls. This one goes to 31, right. 32. Yeah. But these two do. That's that unknown that we'll talk a lot more about at the February meeting. Both of these values both the Genentech and the Intel SIP will depreciate further between now and the time they come on the tax rolls. Not to mention, equipment can be moved. So value can move to other locations outside of Hillsboro. So we're kind of at the mercy of that, but it should still be sizable. So this tax code, using this tax code, this is the total rate of overlapping taxing jurisdictions. If we had applied that rate to this value, it would have been $400 million. I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that nobody is going to pay these taxes and come here and locate here. And that's kind of what I mentioned very early in the presentation. Sure, it would be really nice to collect these taxes and double our taxes collected, but it's not real. It's just on paper. So that's just another way of looking at the same thing. Almost right. Thank you. So this is This is looking at urban renewal now. So moving away from the abated taxes, now we're talking about urban renewal. And this is kind of icing on the cake. And I like to just make sure that we understand that ultimately the city of Hillsboro and the overlapping taxing jurisdictions are going to see the benefits of the labor that has been put up in North Hillsboro. And I just wanted to quantify it today. So in 24-25, if the urban renewal districts, here's the AV for downtown, here's the AV for North Hillsboro, if those had both been on the tax rolls, we would have achieved approximately another $10 million in taxes in 24-25. And the overlapping taxing jurisdictions would have achieved, including Hillsboro, $30 million. So this value here that's sitting in our North Hillsboro and downtown represents 10% of our current city's assessed value. So again, I'm just trying to put some perspective there so you can kind of see the size and scale of some of these investments. I think it's just the one more side. So yeah,
No, you have your key takeaways, sorry.
So just to close us out and take any additional questions, because I know we are now approaching 10 o'clock. Just some of the key takeaways, and Dan can jump in here, as I think Dan actually wrote these. You know, we are in a unique position financially due to, I would say, very intentional planning. In my entire career at the city of Hillsboro, we have really focused on economic development, I think for the right reasons, not just to build our tax base, but to provide for a quality of life that I think, you know, we can see in our parks and we can see across the city in so many different ways. I'm going to let you talk about the industries piece and incentives if you want to.
I'll just leave you with the bullets because I covered these a few
Okay.
times throughout, but we talked about the quality of life pieces. We talked about, I think Councilor Harris put it well, as we use these incentives for the companies, we really use it also to advance the interests, near term, long term, of our community. And really just the importance of that, the approach when we're thinking the finances, but especially the approach when we're thinking incentives, has to be and continues to be balancing and prioritizing both the advancement of the community's needs and aspirations with the business needs as well. Because if that gets too disjointed, we see that those incentives will not produce. And if those incentives are not producing, we will not likely see a community benefit. And we are unsure, and that's a pretty high gamble proposition of how the industries would or would not respond. Do companies up and move? You know, do new companies come here? And what would that be, both again to quality of life, but also back to the underpinnings of the financial piece Suzanne's covered throughout tonight. So thanks. And that's it. So if you have any final questions, I'll turn over to Robbie, but
So
we're happy to answer.
are there, so it sounds like there's a plan for new enterprise zone. Are there more plans for new TIF or urban renewal districts?
Right now, we are pretty close to maxed out in terms of the acreage and assessed value thresholds eligible to us. So if we wanted to evaluate, and we have done this in some other growth areas, also coming at a future discussion, but we would likely have to close out or sunset one or both of the existing urban renewal districts.
Thank you.
And if there was ever an opportunity for another SIP agreement, that would always come to you all. Oftentimes we'll have an executive session where there's sensitive information we need to share, but just so you all know, right, we wouldn't make that decision as a staff. We would prepare everything, bring it to you all, because you all need to make the ultimate decision on whether or not we need to do another agreement like that. So.
Any other questions? Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Val.
Very good.